Chapter 553. The dim light illuminated the side room of Hongguang Palace for the first time. A dim light seeped out from the palace lantern on the table, making the entire room seem a little gloomy. It was even less bright than the moonlight shining through the big hole in the ceiling. The serving girl looked at the dust-covered Fan Xian with a face full of terror. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. With a hiss, Fan Xian's feet crossed and he suddenly took 8 steps forward. His sword stabbed out horizontally, hitting the serving girl's throat. Blood sprayed out. Fan Xian's head was slightly lowered. His wrist turned slightly, and the emperor's sword in his hand came out again. It stabbed out strangely from under his armpit and pointed at a eunuch's throat. He hurriedly retreated another 3 steps. Using the tip of his left foot as a pivot, his entire body began to spin beautifully like a dancer. The emperor's sword in his hand shone with a cold light. Following this spin, it drew out a cold light several feet in front of him. Wherever the cold light passed, the eunuchs and palace maids who were startled awake all fell to the ground in pools of blood. His right foot stomped on the flagstone again, and the flagstone cracked slightly. Fan Xian's body was like a big bird that had been tied up. With a strange posture, he suddenly retreated and crashed fiercely into the chest of someone, breaking all the bones and tendons of that person. He lowered his head, and his right elbow suddenly shot out like a spring. The emperor's sword flew out of his hand and struck the chest of a person who was charging at him from the right. His swordless right fist suddenly punched to the left, knocking the last person to the ground. With a thud, that person did not even have time to react and fell heavily to the ground. His head was shattered like a watermelon. In the blink of an eye, he had killed 8 people. Fan Xian, who had ruthlessly charged into Hongguang Palace, didn't say a word. In the silence, he attacked with all his strength. The emperor's sword and tyrannical jinqi made him like a wandering spirit with unparalleled magic power. In a moment, he seized the lives of all the enemies in the room. He didn't let them make a single sound. His sword style was inherited from Siga Jian, but it lacked Siga Jian's indomitable heavenly killing intent. Instead, it had the shadow's natural coldness. His fist and palm techniques were inherited from the Yi family, but they didn't have Yi Liuyan's carefree and indifferent feeling of floating on the sea. Instead, there was a heroic feeling that came naturally from his tyrannical jinqi. Who could stop such a killing? Of the people in the side hall, other than those who had died on the ground, only Yi Guipin, her son, and Lady Ning remained. Lady Ning had come to see the 3rd prince's injuries, so she did not return to her own quarters. On the contrary, it brought Fan Xian great convenience. None of the 3 nobles could sleep that night. When Fan Xian crashed into the palace like a god, they reacted at the first instant. Separated by a thin veil, they watched Fan Xian's every move nervously. No matter how much confidence they had in Fan Xian, they had not thought that Sir Fan Jr. would use such a violent method to kill off all the internal court personnel watching and protecting him in such a short time. Lifting the curtain, the 3 of them walked down and looked at Fan Xian. The expressions on their faces were all different, but they all had a glimmer of shock. They felt that the Fan Xian in front of them seemed to be different from the Fan Xian before Dong Mountain. Yi Guipin's face was full of joy. Since Fan Xian had taken the risk to kill his way into the palace to save her and her son, then the worry she had spoken to Qingping earlier did not exist. Being watched in Hongguang Palace, Yi Guipin didn't know when she and her son would die. Suddenly seeing her savior tonight, her state of mind relaxed. She then looked at the room full of dead bodies and broken limbs. Involuntarily, her legs weakened and she wanted to fall down. The 3rd prince, Li Qingping, supported his mother's body and looked at his teacher with a grateful gaze. He nodded his head forcefully. His eyes were already wet. Deep in Hongguang Palace, countless guards had surrounded them from outside. the eunuch aces of the internal court were still present. Fan Xian knew that although his violent attack had successfully made contact with the three of them, he had not saved them. It was still a hopeless situation. Thus, he didn't waste any more words with the third prince and Lady Ning. Straightforwardly and coldly, he said, "Follow me and charge out." Charging out was easier said than done. Just based on the 200 people Fan Xian had brought into the palace, it was impossible to control the entire rear palace. Furthermore, he didn't know if the internal purge of the imperial army in the royal palace could be resolved before the situation became dangerous. Fan Xian pulled out his long sword from the eunuch's body and glanced at the silent Lady Ning out of the corner of his eye. Seeing the glimmer of a gratified smile on Lady Ning's face, he couldn't help but smile and take out the black dagger from his boot. The third prince's dagger had already been hidden in the thicket by the Qin corridor. Seeing his teacher take out the dagger, he thought it was for him to protect himself. Supporting his mother, he wanted to take a step forward. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian turned the dagger around and handed it to Lady Ning. Lady Ning held the slender black dagger. A heroic spirit immediately surged out of her. After all, she was a female slave who had survived the northern expedition. She had not forgotten the matter of iron and blood these years. Fan Xian didn't look at the three people again. Without wasting a moment, he walked directly toward the door of the side hall. This door did not lead outside the palace. It led to the front hall. If charging out of the palace was not easy, then it was better to charge into the palace. A palm pressed against the wooden door. Without any warning, it was as if the wooden door was made of paper. Pulled by countless powerful forces, it shattered and flew through the air. Before the wood shavings landed, Fan Xian's palm was already glued to a eunuch's palm. Fan Xian gave a muffled grunt. All of his Jinqi surged forward. With just one exchange of palms, he had already felt the power of this eunuch. There were indeed hidden dragons and crouching tigers among the internal court guards. The disciples taught by old eunuch Hong were indeed not to be trifled with. Fresh blood flowed out of the eunuch's 5 senses. His body was being attacked by the tyrannical Jinqi and could not withstand it at all. However, his mission was only to delay Fan Xian for a moment so that the aces in the front hall and the Empress Dowager could prepare. Fan Xian did not give him the opportunity to delay. Smoke rose between his palms. The poisonous fog headed straight for the face of the highly skilled eunuch. The eunuch's expression changed. Fan Xian's right hand shook. The long sword buzzed and sliced horizontally across his shoulder. This was the difference in power. Under the simultaneous attack of the tyrannical Jinqi and poisonous fog, the eunuch had no energy left to react. He could only watch as the light flashed past his eyes. Fan Xian flipped his left wrist and put the emperor's sword into his sleeve. Without another glance at the eunuch ace, he crouched down slightly with both knees and crashed forward like a giant bird flying into the woods. He did not crash into the path where countless aces surged through. Instead, he crashed directly into the wall of the side hall. With a loud crash, he forcefully smashed a large hole in the wall made of wood and brick. Fan Xian did not care about the safety of the 3 people behind him. He swept directly into the large hole. At this moment, the neck of the eunuch ace standing frozen by the door made a thud and was severed in the middle. His bloody head fell down. Yi Guipin and her son stared dumbstruck at this scene. Lady Ning's face was heavy. Holding the black dagger Fan Xian had given her, she led the startled mother and son into the large hole. She guessed why Fan Xian was in such a hurry and why he had smashed through the large hole to enter the front hall. She also knew that before Fan Xian could control the situation, the safety of these 3 people completely depended on the dagger in her hand. What was needed for a sudden attack? It was to be as fast as lightning and as unexpected as wind and thunder on flat ground. Fan Xian's actions tonight carried out this purpose perfectly. From the moment he entered the rear palace to the moment he was discovered by the guards, his and his subordinates' speed suddenly increased. They swept through the rear palace like a wild wind. He stepped onto the stone railing, smashed the golden tiles, fell into the palace, and killed everyone. All of this happened in the time it takes for a spark to fly off a piece of flint. If one counted from the first cry of the guards, he had only spent the time of a dozen strikes to successfully kill his way into the core palace of Hongguang Palace. It was truly lightning-like speed. Not only did the enemy not have time to react, but Fan Xian did not even leave himself any time to think or judge. He relied on the intelligence he had gathered about the royal palace over the years, the spies in the palace, and his extraordinarily sensitive intuition to kill his way in. Of course, this action relied on the courage he had lacked the most in the past, the arrogance that came from throwing oneself into the jaws of death. When Fan Xian killed his way into Hongguang Palace at the fastest speed, the 50 or 66th Bureau swordsmen following him also spread out in a fan shape in the darkness and surrounded Hongguang Palace. However, these people had purposely suppressed their speed. At this moment, they just happened to arrive at the outskirts of Hongguang Palace. Fan Xian's calculations were very accurate. Although he had somewhat underestimated the reaction speed of the rear palace guards, these 50 or 66th Bureau swordsmen just happened to block the palace guards who were rushing over at a very fast speed. The Overwatch Council swordsmen were skilled in killing people in the dark. The palace guards were the elites of the Qing Kingdom's individual martial power. Although they were far from the Tiger Guards Fan Jian had secretly trained for the royal family, their martial power was still very powerful. Outside Hongguang Palace, killing broke out everywhere. In an instant, knives and swords clashed. Countless people were killed and blood sprayed out. In just a few breaths, the circle formed by dozens of black-clothed swordsmen was forced back a considerable distance toward Hongguang Palace. If one looked closely, one could see that these swordsmen's retreat was not passive. Rather, it was an active choice. Although it looked like they were being pushed back step by step by the guards, they had also pulled back the circle and tightly surrounded the main hall of Hongguang Palace. The smaller the defensive circle, the greater the rebound. Many people had already fallen. The black-clothed assassins had blocked the main door of Hongguang Palace. If the people inside wanted to escape, it would be very difficult. Furthermore, it should not be forgotten that Hongguang Palace was not calm at this moment. This was the tactic Fan Xian had drawn up. Surrounded by chaos on all sides and blossoming in the center. The loyal subordinates of the Overwatch Council relied on the darkness to contend with the increasing number of palace guards. In the center of the royal palace, Hongguang Palace, a bright and vicious flower was about to bloom. This flower had to be pinched between Fan Xian's fingers. At the beginning of the chaos in the palace, the guards and internal court aces reacted quickly. However, the nobles in the palace did not have this ability. The old nannies in Hongguang Palace opened their dazed eyes and silently cursed. They didn't know what had happened outside. A little serving girl with nimble legs heard the coughing on the bed and quickly climbed out to help up the mistress of the Qing kingdom. The Empress Dowager had been having a headache these days. There was a yellow thread tied around her forehead. She leaned tiredly in the arms of a serving girl. A glimmer of confusion flashed through her eyes. The old woman's hearing was not good, so she didn't hear the loud crash when Fan Xian crashed through the roof of the side hall. She also didn't hear the sound of Fan Xian killing 8 people in a flash. This old woman had lived in the palace for many years and had seen countless wild winds and waves. Her immersion in politics and conspiracies immediately alerted her. A cold light flashed through her eyes. She abruptly sat up from the serving girl's arms and shouted in a stern voice, "Close the palace doors. Everyone retreat in." The Empress Dowager's reaction could not be said to be slow. Since she guessed that there was chaos in the palace, the first thing she did was to gather all of her martial power and surround herself. She knew her weight. Since the enemy had entered the palace, she was the first target. Such a reaction was the same as the first time she had heard of her son's death. It was simple and precise. One had to admire it. However, she was destined to be disappointed tonight. Before she could gather her power, someone had already charged into the center of Hongguang Palace. Just as the first clash between the guards outside the palace and the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau rang out, a loud sound suddenly came from the wall behind Hongguang Palace. Bricks and wood flew everywhere, and a hole suddenly appeared. A black figure flew out from this hole, like an azure dragon walking in the night. In an instant, it flew across the sky, heading straight for the Empress Dowager's phoenix bed. The closest distance between the rooms was not the distance between the doors. Rather, it was the wall. 2 rooms appeared to be very far away. Sometimes, they were only separated by a half-foot thick wall. As long as one passed through the wall, the end of the world would be within reach. How many people in this world could be like Fan Xian, able to circulate the tyrannical Jinqi throughout his body and use the pure heart of Tianyi Dao to protect his heart and meridians to prevent the tyrannical Jinqi's backlash? Thus, he could turn himself into a large metal hammer and smash through the thick wall. Fan Xian, dressed in black, leaped toward the Empress Dowager with the power of wind and thunder. Along the way, the air gave out a wretched cry. One could imagine how terrifying his speed had been raised. From the hole in the wall to the bed the Empress Dowager sat on was a distance of 12 meters. On this path, the old nannies and serving girls who had only brushed against the edge of Fan Xian's clothes were all knocked to the ground by the tyrannical Jinqi contained in every part of his body. Their clothes were disheveled, and they were knocked to the ground by blood. The eunuch aces, who had remained in the Empress Dowager's palace, finally moved. 4 roars rang out. 4 withered hands grabbed toward the rapidly advancing Fan Xian's body. Like an old tree blooming, they wanted to capture the giant dragon in the forest. Who knew how many years of pure Jinqi could be cultivated in the 4 withered and old hands? The Empress Dowager sat peacefully in the palace. If she didn't have her own powerful martial power to protect her, how could she use Lady Ning's life to threaten the great prince, who held a large number of troops? After hearing the sound of the wall being torn apart like paper, the Empress Dowager had already turned her head and happened to see this scene. Her gaze was icy and full of confidence. It was as if Fan Xian, who was like a god right now, would become a corpse in the next moment. Contrary to everyone's expectations, Fan Xian did not slow down. However, the aura on his body suddenly disappeared in an instant. It was as if his entire person had suddenly disappeared in midair. His body was still flying, but the tyrannical Jinqi aura on his body had been completely withdrawn. His entire person appeared gentle, calm, and serene. Extremely tyrannical and extremely gentle, these 2 completely different kinds of Jinqi appeared at the same time on one person's body in an instant. The pupils of the 4 powerful eunuch aces constricted slightly. They felt shocked in their hearts. In their lives, not only had they never seen, but they had never heard of anyone who could cultivate 2 kinds of Jinqi that clashed so severely to the peak. Furthermore, these 2 kinds of Jinqi methods were clearly the best martial arts in the world. Although they were shocked, their hands did not slow down. They also did not lose their confidence. These were the 4 powerful internal court aces that Eunuch Hong led. They had always thought they were responsible for protecting the Empress Dowager's safety. They thought that no matter how powerful Fan Xian was, he would not be able to ignore the combined attack of the 4 of them. Fan Xian was not a great grandmaster, but he was the 2nd fastest person in the world. Back then, on the meadow, not even the tip of Haitong's sword could pierce through his tumbling body. Now, his nature had changed and he had gradually merged the 2 kinds of Jinqi. There was only one Wu Zhu in this world. Fan Xian's body suddenly curled up in midair. He raised his left knee and twisted his right shoulder. His body trembled. Unable to borrow any strength in midair, he miraculously turned his body. He trembled for a moment and deviated slightly. The first withered hand grabbed Fan Xian's right shoulder. It was as if it had grabbed a ball of cloud and did not put any strength into it. The second withered hand grabbed Fan Xian's left arm. It grabbed the blade of the sword he had sinisterly hidden in his sleeve. The blade of the sword tore through the sleeve and cut a long wound on the palm that contained pure Jinqi, revealing the white bone inside. Fresh blood was stimulated by the Jinqi and sprayed out, drenching half of Fan Xian's body red. The third withered hand grabbed Fan Xian's right knee and tore off a piece of his clothing. The fourth withered hand missed. It only grabbed one of Fan Xian's shoes. Looking at this scene, a glimmer of coldness flashed through the Empress Dowager's eyes. Before the coldness retreated, a cold light flashed. Like a gust of wind, the sword in Fan Xian's left hand was already resting on the Empress Dowager's neck. Fresh blood dripped down from Fan Xian's torn sleeve and onto the Empress Dowager's clothes and face. Chapter 554. Inside the main hall of Hongguang Palace, there was a death-like silence. Everyone watched this scene with terrified eyes. Other than the light patter of blood dripping onto the bed, there was not a single sound. Fresh blood slid down Fan Xian's clothes and sword. It followed the Empress Dowager's earlobe and wet half of the old woman's face, gradually seeping into her clothes. The sword shining with a cold light rested with unusual stability and coldness on the Empress Dowager's neck. This was the first time since the founding of the Qing kingdom that an assassin had been able to kill his way into the depths of the royal palace and place the blade of a sword on the Empress Dowager's neck. Everyone, including the eunuch's aces, was stunned. They watched as Fan Xian held the Empress Dowager hostage and didn't know what to do. All of this happened too quickly. From the time the alarm sounded outside the hall to Fan Xian descending like a god of death, charging straight into the phoenix bed and controlling the Empress Dowager, only a few breaths had passed. Earlier, in the side hall, Fan Xian had not crashed into the wall. Instead, he had first chosen the wooden door and exchanged a blow with the eunuch ace. He had beheaded him with one strike, successfully making the aces of the internal court turn their attention to the long corridor that led from the side hall to the main hall. However, he had crashed directly into it from behind the wall. Only in such an unexpected and dangerous manner and forcefully withstanding the attacks of 4 old eunuchs had he succeeded. To be able to react so quickly and make such a decision in such a short amount of time, it had to be said that Fan Xian's actions tonight were truly valiant. Furthermore, for the people watching this scene in shock, for some reason, a chill rose from the bottom of their hearts. It was as if Fan Xian would pull back his sword at any moment and send the Empress Dowager to her death. Fan Xian's expression was too calm and cold. It was as if the person under his sword was a normal person and not the Empress Dowager who could affect the situation of the world. Send an order for the guards outside to stop. The inside of the hall was deathly silent. It served to make the wretched cries of killing outside grow louder. The 6th Bureau swordsmen who had broken into the palace were still fighting with the internal guards. After Fan Xian had the Empress Dowager under his sword, he did not hesitate at all. He bent his right knee slightly and carefully hid his body behind the Empress Dowager's back. Flipping his sword around, he rested it on the Empress Dowager's shoulder and moved closer to the Empress Dowager's blood-stained face. His words were very calm, but they carried a power that did not allow anyone to refute him. Everyone felt that if the Empress Dowager did not order the guards outside and the eunuch aces in the hall to stop, Fan Xian might actually take action. However, the Empress Dowager was not an ordinary person. When this Empress Dowager of the Qing kingdom was still King Qing, she had experienced many years of precarious days. Her personality was sincere and steady. She was not an ordinary old woman. Later on, she became the Empress and Empress Dowager for decades, living deep in the palace. She had a dignified and powerful confidence in her heart. The Empress Dowager turned her face and looked coldly at Fan Xian. Her white hair was slightly messy, but her eyebrows were furrowed together. She exuded an innate prestige and said in a cold voice, "You treacherous thing. How dare you threaten me?" Her voice was like cutting gold and breaking jade, shaking everyone in the palace. Fan Xian's heart trembled slightly. He had not thought that the Empress Dowager would be in such a wretched state. In such a dangerous situation, she would still be so unyielding. However, he knew that the Empress Dowager had to maintain her aura in order to obtain more benefits in the following matters. Something even more unexpected had yet to come. There was only a slap. The Empress Dowager had turned her hand and slapped Fan Xian across the face. A faint red palm print appeared on Fan Xian's face. The Empress Dowager did not seem to be afraid of the cold blade across her neck. Her eyes looking at Fan Xian were full of disdain and disdain. In a cold voice, she said, "Do you dare to kill me?" Everyone in Hongguang Palace was shocked. They had not thought that the Empress Dowager would still dare to provoke him so forcefully while being controlled by Fan Xian's blade. Was she not afraid that Fan Xian would actually kill her? Seeing this scene, some of the nannies and serving girls fainted in fear. The Empress Dowager continued to look at Fan Xian coldly and valiantly. Fan Xian's eyes narrowed. Looking at the Empress Dowager's wrinkled face, he didn't say a word. He knew why this old woman was acting so valiantly. She knew that if Fan Xian wanted to control the royal palace, then he would not dare to kill her right now. Furthermore, she was, after all, the Empress Dowager and Fan Xian's blood-related grandmother. She had predicted that Fan Xian would not act in front of so many people. Even if she was wrong, she still had to maintain her aura. Only then would she have a chance to reverse the situation. Just as the Empress Dowager slapped Fan Xian with unusual forcefulness, a change suddenly occurred in Hongguang Palace. Eunuch Ho, who had been standing quietly at the side of the palace, suddenly floated up. He floated up with unusual speed, but he did not charge toward Fan Xian and the Empress Dowager. Instead, he charged toward the large hole Fan Xian had made. A strange light flashed through Fan Xian's eyes, but he did not leave the Empress Dowager's side. He could only watch as Eunuch Ho and a few other eunuch aces restrained a few people beside the hole. Eunuch Ho's hand gripped the third prince's throat tightly. Yi Guipin was restrained by a eunuch. Lady Ning waved her black dagger but was also surrounded by a few eunuchs. "Little Duke, don't be too rash," Eunuch Ho said respectfully with his hand around the third prince's throat with his head lowered. Fan Xian's hand held the sword with unusual steadiness. Looking at Eunuch Ho, a strange light flashed through his eyes. It was only now that he knew that this second-in-command eunuch ranked below Eunuch Yao also had such a high level of cultivation. The current situation was that Fan Xian controlled the Empress Dowager while Eunuch Ho and the other eunuchs controlled the three people Fan Xian cared about. How would the situation develop? Everyone was waiting for Fan Xian's decision. The Empress Dowager's expression was cold, but the blood that had seeped into her clothes was slightly cold. It made her fingers tremble slightly. Fan Xian lowered his head and looked at the Empress Dowager's fingers. He was not silent for long. He only took a deep breath. All of the eunuch aces became alert. They didn't know what he would do next. Fan Xian raised his face and furrowed his brows. He then raised his right hand and viciously slapped it down toward the Empress Dowager's old face. A crisp slap rang out. This sound was even louder than the slap the Empress Dowager had given Fan Xian earlier. The Empress Dowager covered her face in disbelief. A trickle of blood seeped out from the corner of her lips. The old woman's teeth had probably been knocked loose. Everyone in the hall looked at this scene dumbfounded. It was as if this slap had not only landed on the Empress Dowager's face, but also on their own faces and hearts. Who was the one Fan Xian had slapped? It was the Empress Dowager, the Emperor's birth mother, and Fan Xian's grandmother. Yet, Fan Xian dared to slap her. This was a humiliation that could never be erased. Fan Xian had slapped the Empress Dowager. This proved that he had thrown caution to the wind. If he dared to slap you, he dared to kill you. Fan Xian stared at the Empress Dowager's half-swollen face and quietly said, "Let her go. Stop. I don't want to repeat myself a second time." The Empress Dowager was so angry that her entire body trembled. She also felt a glimmer of coldness that came from the depths of the earth. She knew that in the end, she had still underestimated this grandson whose surname was not Li. She had underestimated his coldness and valiant state of mind. She felt the sword on her neck tighten a little more. Perhaps it was only a moment, or perhaps a long time, but the Empress Dowager's gaze finally became a little desolate. She opened her mouth and said, "Do as he wishes. The Empress Dowager will call it personally." "Speak louder," Fan Xian said. The Empress Dowager stared angrily at Fan Xian. She had no choice but to use her old voice to call out to the outside of the hall, "Guards, listen up. All of you stop." For some reason, once the Empress Dowager's edict came out, everyone in the hall let out a breath. Perhaps Fan Xian's behavior had made these people too afraid. They were deathly afraid of witnessing the terrifying scene of a grandson killing his grandmother and an official killing the Empress Dowager. Only Eunuch Ho, who had his hands around the third prince's throat, furrowed his brows slightly. No one knew what he was thinking. "It looks like Eunuch Ho wants you dead," Fan Xian said coldly to the Empress Dowager. The Empress Dowager glanced at Eunuch Ho. The four old eunuchs furrowed their brows and took a step toward Eunuch Ho. Eunuch Ho sighed and loosened his grip. The third prince's terror had not yet settled. The wound he had been stabbed by the assassin in the afternoon began to bleed again. He quickly supported his mother and ran behind Fan Xian in a panic with Lady Ning. Once the Empress Dowager's edict came out, the sounds of fighting surrounding Hongguang Palace immediately disappeared without a trace. It was clear that the swordsmen who had followed Fan Xian into the palace had long received instructions. As long as the guards did not attack, they did not take the opportunity to counterattack. All of the large wooden doors in Hongguang Palace were pushed open at the same time. With a creak, the entire palace became transparent. The people inside the hall could clearly see the tense situation outside. They could see the guards holding straight knives surrounding Hongguang Palace and the countless bodies lying on the empty ground outside the hall. The early autumn night wind also blew in from outside the hall. It was cold and heavy, but it did not allow one to be calm. Following this wind, the smell of fresh blood also entered the hall and rushed straight into everyone's noses. Dozens of black-clothed 6th Bureau swordsmen retreated into Hongguang Palace as quickly as possible and surrounded the eunuchs in the hall. A few powerful old eunuchs of the internal court had no choice but to accept this sullen reality as they were shackled by the Overwatch Council's special metal fingers. The Empress Dowager was in Fan Xian's hands. Fan Xian had already proven that he dared to kill the Empress Dowager. Under such circumstances, how could these internal court aces resist? Even someone like Eunuch Ho, who wanted to resist, was forced by the situation and could not make too many unnecessary movements. Fan Xian looked at his subordinates covered in wounds. His brows twitched again. With a sweep of his gaze, he knew that although the time of the attack outside Hongguang Palace was very short, there were still a dozen loyal subordinates who had died just like that. It was impossible to break into the royal palace without people dying. To be able to temporarily control Hongguang Palace by paying such a small price was already an impossible mission. Fan Xian lowered his eyes and said to the Empress Dowager under his sword, "You know, I won't kill you. If I only wanted to kill you, I have countless ways to make you die without even knowing how you died." The Empress Dowager coughed violently and held her chest. Her neck had been scraped by Fan Xian's sword, leaving a bloody mark. Seeing this scene, the eunuchs and serving girls loyal to the Empress Dowager revealed terrified expressions. They wanted to go forward and serve her, but they didn't dare to move. The Empress Dowager turned her head and stared at Fan Xian with a venomous gaze. "You are the same as your mother, with wild ambitions. I want to see what you can do holed up in the royal palace." Even if Fan Xian had captured the Empress Dowager and controlled the royal palace, what should he do next? Everyone, including the black-clothed swordsman, stared at him, waiting for his next order. Fan Xian was waiting for news from the other three groups in the royal palace. He was also waiting for movement in the royal palace. He knew that success had not completely arrived. If things went wrong, his people would fail on the verge of success. While he was waiting, he did not remain idle. He glanced coldly at Eunuch Ho, who was surrounded by the swordsmen. Eunuch Ho's heart trembled. He secretly circulated his xinqi. Fan Xian nodded. Eunuch Ho paled in shock. He flipped his sleeves and prepared to fight. Unexpectedly, when he raised his eyes, he saw a dozen little crossbows flashing with a black light pointed at him. Fan Xian had put a lot of effort into disguising the 200 people he had brought into the palace because he was afraid of alerting enemies outside the palace. It was impossible for everyone to carry crossbows. Only the dozens of people following him carried 10 hidden crossbows. At this moment, these hidden crossbows were pointed directly at Eunuch Ho. Eunuch Ho roared. His body suddenly rose, but he only rose a foot before his entire body became a porcupine. The 10 crossbow bolts pierced deeply into his body, sucking blood endlessly from his body. With a thud, Eunuch Ho fell to the ground and twitched a few times. He opened his eyes, unwilling to close, and died. Fan Xian looked at this scene coldly. Although he didn't know that Eunuch Ho was the eldest princess' trusted aide, intuition and the scene earlier made him wary. That was why he had suddenly acted and ordered his subordinates to suddenly shoot Eunuch Ho to death. At such a critical moment, Fan Xian was not afraid to kill. He would rather kill wrongly than miss out. Eunuch Ho's death startled the palace into an uproar. The situation, which had just calmed down, became chaotic again. The guards surrounding the palace also became nervous and moved a few steps closer in the direction of Hongguang Palace. Fan Xian did not panic. He slowly removed the sword from the Empress Dowager's neck and swept his gaze across the scene. Wherever his gaze landed, no one dared to look directly at him. They all lowered their heads. He sat down beside the Empress Dowager and lowered his head to circulate his qi. Listening to the clamor in various places in the royal palace, he knew that the three groups must have also encountered powerful resistance. Fortunately, his sudden entry into Hongguang Palace had attracted the most eunuch aces and most of the guards in the rear palace. Jinggu and the other two groups should have it a little easier. It was completely silent in Hongguang Palace. Fan Xian and the Empress Dowager sat side by side on the bed. The grandfather and grandson were both stained with other people's blood and chilled their hearts. Such a scene of grandfather and grandson calmly sitting next to each other chilled the hearts of all who saw it. The guards outside the palace had not disarmed. Fan Xian did not have extra people to carry out such an important task. All of the black-clothed swordsmen had already returned to the palace. He did not want the situation to change at all. The problem of the internal guards should be handed to him to deal with after the great prince dealt with the problem of the royal palace guards. He only waited. He believed in the strength of his subordinates and the Black Knights. He didn't wait for long. A clamor suddenly arose among the internal guards outside the palace. It seemed that something shocking had happened at the back of the camp. Fan Xian did not rise. He said to the Empress Dowager beside him, "Have them make a path." The Empress Dowager's white hair hung by the side of her blood-stained face. The half of her face that was not blood-stained had been swollen by Fan Xian's heavy slap. She looked unusually wretched. Listening to Fan Xian's words, she glanced outside with her listless eyes and nodded. The head of the guards looked at the situation inside the palace. Gritting his teeth, he opened up a gap in the encirclement. A dozen black-clothed assassins carrying a disheveled concubine walked into Hongguang Palace. Fan Xian looked at the number of people and his heart thumped. He knew that even more people had died in this group. After he saw the glimmer of panic in the concubine's beautiful face, he couldn't help but feel his heart jump. The one who came was Lady Shu, the second prince's birth mother. Ever since the Empress Dowager had decreed that the crown prince had succeeded the throne and the second prince had submitted, the Empress Dowager had sent the crown prince, the empress, the eldest princess, and Lady Shu back to their respective palaces to live. She only left Yi Guipin, her son, and Lady Ning in Hongguang Palace. Fan Xian gazed at Lady Shu and smiled warmly. He patted the soft bed beside him and said, "Your Highness, please sit here." Lady Shu had been fond of poetry and books since a young age. Her temperament was light. Usually, her relationship with Fan Xian in the palace was considered good. Because of the second prince's matter, there had not been much animosity between them. She was also a taciturn person who was wise to protect herself. Fan Xian did not have much ill feelings toward her. However, in the sudden attack on the palace tonight, she was someone he had to control. Lady Shu had been kidnapped by assassins. She had thought she was going to die, but she had guessed who had done such a treasonous thing. Looking at Fan Xian's face, she couldn't help but feel a wave of terror rise in her heart. She couldn't even say the angry words she had prepared earlier. She looked at the Empress Dowager's wretched appearance and felt a chill in her heart. She could only shrink back and sit by Fan Xian's side. The first to be captured was Lady Shu. This was within Fan Xian's expectations. The defenses of the Eastern Palace and Guangxin Palace were second only to Hongguang Palace. They were also important places. His subordinates would not have been able to succeed so quickly. So, when he saw the silver-masked Jinggu lead his subordinates into Hongguang Palace with a silent expression, his heart sank. He knew things were troublesome. The matter was indeed troublesome. Jinggu lowered his head and said something by Fan Xian's ear. Fan Xian's expression grew heavier and heavier. It was as if there was a giant rock weighing thousands of kilograms between his brows, making it difficult to relax. Another subordinate reported back. It was still bad news. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and rubbed them forcefully. It was as if he wanted to chase away the worry in his heart. A moment later, he sighed and quietly said something to the person on the bed. "I had wanted to have a family reunion. Looks like that won't be possible." On the bed sat the Empress Dowager and Lady Shu. Behind him sat Yi Guipin, Lady Ning, and the third prince. Most of the people of the royal family were on this bed. Fan Xian controlled the life and death of the two people beside him in the most absolute close range, protecting the three people behind him. The so-called family was the emperor's family. Now that the Qing emperor had passed away, other than the 6 people on the bed, there was also the crown prince, the empress, and the eldest princess in Guangxin Palace. Fan Xian unconsciously excluded the gardener because he felt that King Jing was much cleaner than everyone else in the family. The heavy rocks between Fan Xian's brows were the 3 members who had not come for the family reunion. The news Jinggu and the other group had reported was that the Eastern Palace and Guangxin Palace were completely empty. For some reason, the eldest princess and the crown prince seemed to have received the news ahead of time. Just a moment before Fan Xian's subordinates killed their way into the palace, they took advantage of the dark night and fled in the direction of the cold palace in the north. Jinggu and the hundreds of assassins did not catch up. Such a violent and wanton surprise attack had not captured the most important figures. Fan Xian's mood was unusually heavy, but his expression gradually warmed. Although he had not completely succeeded in breaking into the palace this time, he had, after all, captured the Empress Dowager and Lady Shu. There was never anything perfect in this world. He knew that his luck was not good enough to use 200 people to change the course of history. The Empress Dowager sitting by his side suddenly said in an old voice, "I know what you want to do. However, my edict has long been sent down." It was clear that everything Jinggu said next to Fan Xian's ear had landed in the Empress Dowager's ears. A glimmer of mockery flashed through her eyes. Looking at Fan Xian, she said, "Qingqian has left the palace with my edict. Tomorrow, the army will enter the capital. Are you afraid? My courage grows every day. Otherwise, I wouldn't have dared to slap your face until it's swollen." Fan Xian looked at the Empress Dowager with a slight smile. The coldness in his words made one shiver. The Empress Dowager's pupils constricted. "The Empress Dowager can have many edicts," Fan Xian said gently to the Empress Dowager. "For example, the 13 city gate guards are still under your control. As long as you send down another edict to close the city gates, how will the Qin family come in? I think you know that the trusted aide the eldest princess placed in the city gate guards was killed by someone I sent last night. I am helping you firmly control the 9 city gates. Of course, my goal is to control you." These words came out of Fan Xian's thin lips. They were particularly gentle and terrifying. The Empress Dowager was so angry that her entire body trembled. She glared at him but couldn't say a single word. "Although you are already 70 or 80 years old, you are still afraid of death." Fan Xian furrowed his brows and looked at the Empress Dowager as if he was looking at something that annoyed him. "Thus, you will have to send down this edict." The Empress Dowager coughed and glanced at Lady Ning behind her. She then turned her head to stare into Fan Xian's eyes and said, "Even if that barbarian helps you, the most you can do is control the royal palace. What can you do outside the palace?" Fan Xian stared back into her eyes and said, "I only brought 200 people into the palace. It's not that I am confident. I left 1,700 people outside the palace. What do you think I can do outside the palace?" Some distance away from Hongguang Palace, at the intersection of the rear palace and the front palace, a loud cry for killing suddenly exploded out, as well as the sound of the palace doors exploding. Fan Xian listened quietly. He knew that the great prince's imperial army had finally arrived. His heart relaxed. He stood and ordered Jinggu, "I hand Hongguang Palace to you. No matter who it is, if they make any strange movements, kill them." Jinggu accepted the order without any objection. The silver mask on his face shone with a chilling light. Everyone in the palace looked at this person. They didn't know what his identity was for him to accept Fan Xian's seemingly rebellious order so calmly and calmly. If it was a normal Overwatch Council official, they would probably feel some fear in their hearts. They didn't know that this deputy commander of the Black Knights had once picked on the eldest son of the Qin family in the military camp. He had stayed in the Qin kingdom's death prison for a long time and suffered countless torments. He had always been a rebellious person, which was why Fan Xian dared to hand him such a rebellious matter. At this moment, Lady Ning suddenly lowered her head and said, "Let me borrow your dagger for a while." Fan Xian glanced at her and smiled. He knew that Lady Ning was afraid that if something truly went wrong, Jinggu wouldn't dare to act against the Empress Dowager. She, the Dongyi female prisoner of war and the child in her belly who had almost been killed by the Empress Dowager, had been waiting for this opportunity with a fierce and hot-blooded nature. Fan Xian nodded at her and then walked toward the darkness outside Hongguang Palace. He was going to Guangxin Palace and the Eastern Palace to investigate. He kept feeling that this matter revealed a very strange message. With a clang, he slid the blood-stained sword back into the sword case on his back and walked down the stone steps of Hongguang Palace. The trusted aides of the Qinian unit who had followed him into the palace followed 3 steps behind him and also walked down the stone steps. Everyone inside and outside the palace watched him. They didn't know where he was going at such a critical moment. Leading a few subordinates, he calmly walked out of the palace. He walked past the internal guards holding weapons pointed at him as if they were facing great chaos. He didn't even blink. The guards did not dare make a move. They could only watch as he disappeared into the black clothes outside Hongguang Palace. Although the Empress Dowager was in the palace, Fan Xian's calmness and bravery shocked the hearts of many people. Fan Xian did not purposely suppress the Empress Dowager's arrogance. The words he said earlier were not false. When he and Yan Bingyun had made the plan in the boudoir of Lady Sun Pin, or of the Jingdo government, he had already calculated how much power he could contact. The secret agents the Overwatch Council could move in the capital, the spies hidden in various manners, and the first bureau Fan Xian controlled could still move 1,400 people, even excluding the square building monitored by the internal court and the military. Through the Jingdo government, the 500 Black Knights hidden outside Jingdo entered the capital in disguise. Thus, the power Fan Xian could use reached 1,900 people. Furthermore, these 1,900 people were all skilled in working in the dark. Although they were far from a match for the military in terms of martial power, they were a handy weapon when it came to plotting and rebellion. Fan Xian only brought 200 people into the palace tonight. It was not that he was arrogant. For a sudden attack like this, which focused on speed and surprise, the number of people was never the key. Furthermore, he had to leave a large portion of his power outside the palace. The remaining 1,700 people were doing all kinds of work under Yan Bingyun's orders. Jingdo was too big. Fan Xian had to take care of too many things. He handled the outside of the palace himself. Inside the palace, he had to rely on the thousands of imperial soldiers to control the situation. When the cries of killing came from the rear palace, he knew that the great prince had already taken control of the imperial army. The imperial army's actions were just as the great prince had said to his trusted officer. The timing of their attack depended on the progress of Fan Xian's advance into the palace. When Fan Xian's brave subordinate stopped his steps in the encirclement of guards and sent out the signal arrow toward the night sky and bright moon, the imperial army moved. The signal arrow was bright. In an instant, it lit up half of the royal palace. This kind of signal arrow used to send messages was not the kind the Jingdo garrison and Overwatch Council often used, but it already gave a clear signal. The great prince stood beside the city guarding crossbow and looked at the signal arrow slicing through the night sky. The lines on his face suddenly hardened. Raising his right hand, he chopped down like a knife. It chopped down into the empty night wind at the corner tower of the royal palace. A knife chopped down and directly cut the necks of 2 soldiers on the bed at the same time. Fresh blood sprayed onto the wall with a splash. Unusually bloody, the attack created 2 large flowers of blood. The knife-wielding Imperial Army general who attacked in the night pulled back his long knife and roared, "Kill!" In the dark night, countless people surged into the streets beside the square in front of the royal palace. Silently, they entered the large rooms and began a bloody massacre. A total of 600 Imperial Army soldiers who had been switched to rest were still asleep. Many of them had lost their lives just like that. Some of them had been startled awake, but before they could react, they were greeted with merciless sabers and spears. Those who killed and those who were killed were all fellow soldiers. If this was a different time and place, perhaps they would fight shoulder to shoulder with the Hu people. Drinking hot knives and rubbing their shiny knives, they would bravely kill their way into the enemy camp, blocking arrows and knives for each other. However, tonight was not like that. It was only one side facing the other, an unusually merciless massacre. Before long, the 2,000 imperial soldiers loyal to the great prince had cleaned up a large area in front of the royal palace. Countless corpses and fresh blood mixed together. The stench of blood rose to the sky. The expressions of the imperial soldiers were not good. They were usually part of the Western Expedition Army. This was the first time they had killed their own people. However, they also knew that these people were not on their side. What they had done tonight did not allow them to show the slightest bit of weakness. They had seen the royal seal sent by the commander and the emperor's posthumous edict, so they had hot blood and faith in their hearts. We are on the side of justice. Right now, they were still alive. Who could say otherwise? After returning home, I have been writing for 3 consecutive days. I am really tired. Tomorrow, I will write less to rest. As for writing, please rest assured. Of course, I am not writing. Cough, cough, I am really ashamed. Chapter 555. One arrow pierced through the clouds, and thousands of soldiers and horses came to meet. When that dazzling firework bloomed in Jingdo's silent night sky, although it was only for a moment, it shocked countless people. The internal purge of the imperial army was the first work to begin. Before long, the great prince successfully controlled all of the power. The 3,000 or so imperial army soldiers left in Jingdo became the most powerful military force protecting the royal palace. At the same time, the Overwatch Council subordinates hidden in the darkness also saw this firework. They revealed themselves from the darkness and began to advance toward their respective targets. The Yamen of the Ministry of Justice had always been sinister, particularly on a night like this. In the silence, a wave of hurried footsteps suddenly rang out outside the Ministry of Justice. The bailiffs responsible for the night watch watched the movement outside the Yamen with astonishment. They then discovered with astonishment that a large group of people wearing black official robes were pressing toward the Ministry of Justice. The bailiffs' faces were deathly pale. They immediately sounded the gong to warn the people in the Ministry of Justice, as well as the prison guards at the back of the Ministry of Justice. They immediately retreated toward the Yamen of the Ministry of Justice because they knew that these black official robes were from the Overwatch Council. They were not a match for them. The sound of the warning rang out. The subordinates of the Ministry of Justice all hurried to the back. Everyone knew that the Ministry of Justice's prison was of the utmost importance. The Crown Prince did not dare to imprison the civil officials who opposed his ascension into the Overwatch Council's prison and had locked them all up there. Although these people were only prisoners in the Ministry of Justice, when they were placed in court, they were officials that even the Empress Dowager had to be wary of. There were not many terrifying sounds of killing. After a few wretched cries and a wave of chaos, the Overwatch Council's 300 or so people entered the depths of the Yamen of the Ministry of Justice and charged into the large square. The bailiffs of the Ministry of Justice and prison guards were surrounded in the center by Overwatch Council officials. The disheveled main official of the Ministry of Justice looked at this scene and couldn't help his heart becoming cold. The two sides had about the same number of people. It seemed that they had the power to fight. However, this minister, who was like the commander of the imperial army and did not dare to go home and only guarded the prison in the Ministry of Justice, could not summon any thought of resistance. The black-clothed men held crossbows in their hands. They were the Overwatch Council officials that Qing officials feared the most. The minister knew that since the Overwatch Council dared to act so wildly, Sir Fan Jr. must have begun to stir up a bloody storm inside Jingdo. The remaining power of the Overwatch Council still existed, and Fan Xian's dark name intimidated everyone's hearts. Without the help of the eldest princess power, not many people dared to directly oppose this group. Moreover, he had also heard that a signal arrow had been fired from the palace. Then, he woke up in a panic and clearly heard the heaven-shaking battle cries that soared into the sky from the imperial city. He didn't know that it was the imperial army, but he knew that there was a change in the imperial city. A number of corpses lay scattered on the field. The leading official of the Overwatch Council looked coldly at the surrounded Minister of Justice. Enunciating each word, he said, "I have come by the Empress Dowager's edict and Prince Hiching's military order to bring the old officials out of prison. I would have to trouble you, Minister, to hand them over." Hand them over. No, this was a prison break. The Minister of Justice trembled and didn't dare to speak or curse. Last night, one of his right-hand assistant ministers had died in this hall without anyone knowing. No one knew how the assistant minister had died. The minister didn't want to become a second wronged person. If he surrendered, would he have a chance to live? The light of the torch made the Minister of Justice's expression strange. Seeming to guess his thoughts, the leading Overwatch Council official stared into his eyes and said, "The Empress Dowager has said that all those who have rebelled will be forgiven if they truly repent." The Minister of Justice smiled bitterly. He had even brought up the Empress Dowager's edict. It looked like the Duke of Donbua had already taken control of the royal palace. There was still no news from the eldest princess side. Something had probably gone wrong. With such a situation, why should he bitterly hold on? In a flash, he suddenly thought that if the battle in the royal palace had not been resolved and Fan Xian had not gained the upper hand, if he surrendered so easily, how would he explain it to the crown prince and the eldest princess? The Minister of Justice gritted his teeth. His gaze changed endlessly. The Overwatch Council official looked at him coldly and didn't continue to communicate with him. He slowly raised his right hand. Some of the hundreds of Overwatch Council officials around him raised their crossbows. Some pulled out metal drills. They began to prepare to attack the heavy doors of the Ministry of Justice's prison. On the count of 3. The Overwatch Council official counted expressionlessly. 3, 2, wait. The Minister of Justice was finally crushed by this monotonous count. In a hoarse voice, he yelled, "Wait. I want the Duke of Donbua's words." A mocking smile rose to the corners of the Overwatch Council official's lips. In such a dangerous situation, the Minister of Justice's courage had been crushed. He had not become stupid. He knew that the Empress Dowager's edict was only a piece of broken paper. What could truly save his life was the commissioner's will. He took out a document he had prepared a long time ago and tossed it over. The Minister of Justice picked it up from the ground. Using the dim light of the torch, he read the document again and confirmed that it was the decree personally written by Sir Fan Jr. No one knew when this decree had been written or prepared, but it clearly said that the eldest princess and the crown prince had conspired with Dongyi and northern Qi assassins to assassinate the emperor on Dong Mountain. Each crime was clear. At the back, it said that the governor of the northern expedition camp, Yan Xiaoyi, was involved in the rebellion and had been personally executed by Fan Xian. The crime was not important. What the Minister of Justice cared about was the last words. Reading to the end, his expression finally eased a little. In this document, titled "Summon the Imperial Edict to Punish the Traitors," there were about 400 words in total. In the last 100 words, it clearly said that the officials in court had been deceived by Li Qingqian. As long as they repented and performed meritorious deeds for the new throne, the past would be forgiven. The Minister of Justice's hand trembled as he held the decree. This decree did not have the Empress Dowager's seal, but it had the Emperor's royal seal. The most important thing was that Fan Xian had personally made his signature on it. The Minister of Justice knew that at a time like this, no royal seal would be more effective than Fan Xian's signature. Furthermore, he believed that Fan Xian was not someone who would go back on his word. His face grew increasingly pale. He glanced at the Ministry of Justice Yamen guards around him who were summoning up their courage but had ashen faces. He lowered his head and knelt in front of the Overwatch Council official. In a wretched voice, he said, "I plead guilty." Disarming, finger-binding, leashing. All of the Ministry of Justice's armed forces were brought under control in a very short amount of time. It was just that this group of people left some face for the minister, except for the official robe and the black gauze that he was not wearing properly. All kinds of knives, spears, and sticks were piled in the corner. All of the officials of the Ministry of Justice had their arms bound behind their backs with special steel finger cuffs made by the Overwatch Council. These finger cuffs were all tied together with sturdy hemp ropes. They were like grasshoppers strung together during a famine. All of these actions appeared particularly familiar and fast. From the day the Overwatch Council Yamen was born, they had used these methods to deal with the various Yamens of the Qing Kingdom's enormous state apparatus. It could not be said that the Minister of Justice was timid or the Qing Kingdom's Yamen were useless. However, it had been many years. The terror of the Overwatch Council had been deeply rooted in the hearts of all Qing officials. Like a natural enemy, the officials faced this group of black-clothed people could not muster up any courage to resist. After the Qing Emperor died and Qin Pingping was poisoned, the Overwatch Council, this terrifying royal secret service had become the sharpest blade in Fan Xian's hands. While dealing with the remaining affairs of the Ministry of Justice, the two heavy doors of the Ministry of Justice had long been opened. Overwatch Council officials entered and split off many people to help out 40 or 50 wretched-looking officials. These officials did not have time to remove their official robes, but they were already covered in wounds. From this, one could see how hurried and chaotic the Crown Prince had been when he had arrested these officials in Taiji Palace. Many of the officials had no strength to walk after being punished. With the support of these Overwatch Council officials, they were barely able to move out of the door of the Ministry of Justice prison. The eyes of the leading Overwatch Council official narrowed. He quickly walked forward and knelt on one knee in front of these officials. Making a heavy bow, he said in a low voice, "I am the head of the Second Bureau of the Overwatch Council, Murong Yen. On the Empress Dowager's orders, I have come to welcome you. Thank you for your hard work." The civil officials who had been helped out looked at this black-clothed Overwatch Council official and couldn't help but feel a mixture of emotions. They couldn't say anything. Murong Yen did not rise. Instead, he turned and bowed solemnly to the two leading officials. In a low voice, he said, "The commissioner has ordered me to thank the two scholars on his behalf." These two officials were the two first-level officials who had courageously rebelled in Taiji Palace and forcefully stopped the Crown Prince's ascension. They were the heads of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, Hu the Scholar and Sir Shu Wu. There were still wounds on Shu Wu's face. Looking at this official, he sighed. He did not feel much joy at having escaped. There was only a deep worry for the situation in Jingdo. He knew Fan Xian's personality. Since he had risked his life to break into the prison tonight, the royal palace would certainly be in chaos. The emperor, who knew how many of the emperor's relatives would die in this storm? Hu the Scholar smiled and said, "The Duke of Donbua is wrong. I did not help him. Where is the word thanks?" Murong Yen was surprised by these words. There was no time to explain the situation in the palace in detail. 10 carriages had already arrived outside the Ministry of Justice. They took the injured officials into the carriages and headed toward the royal palace. The situation in Jingdo was still very dangerous. These officials who had just escaped prison could not return to their manors for now. Watching the carriages under the Overwatch Council's protection move along the long street toward the royal palace, Murong Yen, standing outside the door of the Ministry of Justice, finally let out a big breath. Although there were still many things he needed to take care of in the Ministry of Justice yamen behind him, his heart had already calmed down. He was the head registrar of the Second Bureau. Originally, he was responsible for gathering intelligence. In the Overwatch Council incident, he had been given the task of forcefully attacking the Ministry of Justice by Sir Yen Jr. Perhaps he had taken a liking to his calmness. It was not difficult to forcefully attack the Ministry of Justice. What was difficult was to rescue the officials in the prison unharmed. Murong Yen knew this very well. Otherwise, the commissioner would not have given him hundreds of people when Jingdo had so few people. The specific mission had been given by Yen Bingyun, but the requirements had been personally drawn up by Fan Xian. Fan Xian had given a death order to the Ministry of Justice prison. He wanted to ensure the safety of the scholars Hu and Shu, as well as the civil officials. He knew that if these courageous civil officials had not risen up in Taiji Palace and forcefully delayed the crown prince's ascension, throwing court politics into chaos and Jingdo into chaos, it would have been difficult for him to find an opportunity to successfully break into the palace. These civil officials, who did not seem to have much power other than opening their mouths to remonstrate, were the true heroes of Fan Xian's mission. Fan Xian had borrowed the bones of these officials, so he had to ensure that their bones were unharmed. This was gratitude and a faint sense of guilt. When the Ministry of Justice prison was opened, the Jingdo government, which had seemed even more difficult to attack, had its main doors wide open and brightly lit. It appeared very strange. The Jingdo government was responsible for Jingdo's security and had many bailiffs and officials under its command. When the signal arrow for the fireworks outside the royal palace rang out, the serious-looking second-level official, the Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu, walked into the main hall with a heavy expression. His subordinates, who didn't understand what had happened, looked at the magistrate with wide eyes and tongues tied. They wondered why Sir Sun was still wearing his official robes so late at night. After a few breaths, the sound of footsteps arrived like thunder. Sun Jingxiu glanced at his subordinates with a complicated expression and sighed with great regret. He ordered his subordinates to open the main doors of the Jingdo government. Once the doors opened, the officials of the Overwatch Council filed in. Under the gazes of the Jingdo government officials, they took up advantageous positions in the main hall and surrounded Sun Jingxiu in the center. The black-robed Overwatch Council officials parted and a person walked out. It was the head of the first bureau of the Overwatch Council, Mu Tai. This steel-faced official looked coldly at Sun Jingxiu and asked, "Sir, you have ordered me to ask you, have you thought it through?" Sun Jingxiu sighed again. After a moment of struggle, his legs seemed to suddenly lose strength. With a bang, he knelt to the ground and said in a low voice, "I know my mistake, but I do not dare to ask for your forgiveness." After this scene appeared, the entire scene burst into an uproar. Everyone felt incomparably shocked. They didn't understand why the magistrate, who had been carrying out the Empress Dowager's edict and desperately trying to capture Fan Xian and Jingdo, would not resist when the Overwatch Council officials arrived and just surrender. Mu Tai's expression remained like steel. It was as if he had not moved, but he was also incomparably shocked in his heart. He had come under orders to stabilize the Jingdo government. He had thought he was going to face the most tragic battle of his life. Unexpectedly, Yen Bingyun had only lightly given him an order and had him come like this. Entering the Jingdo government, he saw the manor filled with light. Mu Tai had thought he had fallen into an ambush. Unexpectedly, the situation was just as Sir Yen Jr. had said. It had gone surprisingly smoothly. Sun Jingxiu knelt on the ground with an unusually pale expression. His left hand held the black gauze in his arms. He thought that he had been forced. Putting aside whether or not the Jingdo government could resist the Overwatch Council, the conversation with the white-clothed man in the front and back gardens had left him with no way out. He could only surrender. It was not until tonight that he learned that Fan Xian had been hiding in his manor for a number of days. The place of the change in Jingdo was in his back garden, in his daughter's room. Of the assassins who broke into the palace, 400 had used the Jingdo government's documents to sneak into Jingdo. As long as this matter was revealed, no matter how he performed tonight, he would not be tolerated by the crown prince or the eldest princess. They would certainly think he was a spy on Fan Xian's side. Thus, he had no other choice. He could only make a difficult decision and completely lean toward Fan Xian. In any case, people would think he was Sir Fan Jr.'s man, so he might as well become Sir Fan Jr. At least he could survive. His future, safety. Pin would probably speak up for him, right? Thinking of this, Sun Jingxiu's blood involuntarily surged. He was so angry he almost fainted. The documents and precautions for the assassins who broke into the palace to enter the capital had all been sent out from his study. Other than Pin, who else could fake his handwriting and use his official seal without being suspected by his subordinates? In his next life, he would never have a daughter. Daughters would always side with outsiders. The Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu, who had been forced to turn traitor, thought with incomparable sorrow. Not long after the battle in the royal palace ended, a large group of imperial soldiers forced their way into the back of the palace through the front door. In front of thousands of tiger wolf-like soldiers, the already frightened internal court guards and eunuchs wisely chose to surrender. Even if there were some stubborn ones, they became corpses under the sweep of the imperial soldiers. The back of the palace temporarily recovered its silence. One could faintly hear the sound of orderly footsteps and the clatter of armor hitting each other. With a heavy expression, Fan Xian pushed open the main door of the eastern palace and left the swordsmen who had broken into the palace outside. Looking at the dead bodies along the way, he walked into the palace that had just been repaired. In Hongguang Palace, Fan Xian appeared calm. Only he knew how disappointed he was in the depths of his heart. Not capturing the crown prince and eldest princess was the same as tearing a large hole in his plan. A hole that could never be mended. He looked at the eunuchs and serving girls cowering in a circle. A moment later, he silently lowered his head. It was as if he could hear the sound of horse hooves ringing out outside the distant palace walls. He knew this was an auditory hallucination. However, he believed in the speed of the great prince's army. Since the palace was basically under control, he must have already sent out large groups and begun to advance deeper into Jingdo in an effort to control a larger area. However, he would be careful not to come into contact with the 13 city gate guards and cause trouble. The great prince was like him. Since he had taken action, he would not hold back. The Imperial Army and Overwatch Council were doing their best to track the Crown Prince and eldest princess in Jingdo. Chapter 556. Seeing Fan Xian walk in with a heavy expression, the soulless Hongzhu climbed up from the ground and knelt in front of him. He lowered his head and didn't say a word. There was no one else around this room in the Eastern Palace. There was only the standing Fan Xian and kneeling Hongzhu. The dim light from outside shone in and cast their shadows on the wall. It looked strange. Fan Xian stared at Hongzhu's soulless face. The hands hanging by his sleeves tightened into fists and then slowly relaxed. Tiredly, he said, "I need an explanation for this matter." Hongzhu raised his head and glanced at him. His eyes were full of guilt and deep self-blame. However, he only lowered his head again and kowtowed. He didn't explain anything. Hongzhu was Fan Xian's greatest help in the royal palace. The reason Fan Xian dared to break into the back palace with just 200 people and control Hongguang Palace in one move was because he had a complete grasp of the situation in the back palace, the distribution of the palace guards, and the details of the nobles' lives. All of this was the intelligence Hongzhu had taken the risk to send outside the palace during these 2 days. This rapidly rising eunuch had originally been moved into Hongguang Palace. After the crown prince returned to the eastern palace, he reluctantly asked for it back. Since the Empress Dowager wanted the crown prince to inherit the throne, she would not stop his small request. Thus, Hongzhu became the strangest person in the royal palace. He had once held memorials in the royal study, served the Empress Dowager in Hongguang Palace, and spent 2 months with the Empress in the Eastern Palace. Strangely, all of the nobles admired and liked him. Fan Xian was no exception. However, no one knew that Hongzhu was Fan Xian's spy in the palace. The reason the guards on duty on the way from the palace gates to Hongguang Palace were strangely poisoned and unable to give an early warning was all because of this eunuch. Hongzhu had played a large part in Fan Xian's success in breaking into the palace. However, Fan Xian's gaze as he looked at him was not very gentle. He needed an explanation. The crown prince and empress were in the eastern palace, under Hongzhu's eyes. How could they react to such a thunderous attack on the palace and escape before Fan Xian's sharp sword arrived? Fan Xian's fists tightened. A gloomy voice seeped out from between his teeth. He smiled coldly and said, "Was it you who leaked the information?" Hongzhu didn't dare look at Fan Xian's cold eyes and nodded his head heavily. Fan Xian sucked in a cold breath and looked at him in disbelief. "Do you know what you're doing? We are rebelling, not playing house." In order to not let the people in the Eastern Palace hear, he did not raise his voice, but the emotions inside gradually became frantic. "What happened to you? Soft-hearted?" Fan Xian's brows were tightly furrowed. Using an extremely fast and cold voice, he said, "Your soft-heartedness will harm the entire Qin kingdom." He spat on the ground next to his feet and cursed hatefully. "I went through untold hardships to get into the palace, but you played such a trick. It's fine if you don't want to live, but what about the people in the palace? You're forcing me to prepare to run before dawn." Fan Xian felt a rare sense of anger. He could not understand how such a meticulous plan, which mobilized the spies he had spent countless hours and effort hiding in the palace, had, for reasons he could not understand, made such a big mistake. Why? Why? Fan Xian stared at Hongzhu's face. A dark fire flashed through his eyes. "The crown prince treats me very well." Hongzhu knelt in front of Fan Xian and suddenly began to cry. Tears flowed down from the corners of his eyes and followed along his young face into his clothes. "The Empress is very pitiful. I thought and thought, but in the end, I couldn't resist it." Hongzhu cried out loud. Snot and tears flowed down his face. "Sir, kill me. I don't want to live anymore. I killed Xiao or myself. I don't know how many more people I will kill. It's all my fault, my fault." Fan Xian sucked in a cold breath. Although he had already cursed earlier, he had not thought that the reason Hongzhu let the crown prince and empress go was actually because of his soft-heartedness. What happened in Guangxin Palace? I don't know. The corners of Fan Xian's eyes twitched. His heart felt a glimmer of coldness. Looking at the eunuch kneeling in front of him, he suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Stand up." Hongzhu knelt on the ground, not daring to rise. "Stand up." Fan Xian roared in a low voice. Hongzhu timidly stood up but suddenly felt a pain in his crotch. He couldn't help but cry out in pain. Fan Xian slowly pulled his hand back. There was a complicated emotion on his face. Looking at Hongzhu, he didn't say a word. A moment later, he only shook his head and sighed. Hongzhu's face was deathly pale. He looked at Fan Xian with extreme terror. Immediately after, he thought that since he had secretly informed the Empress and Crown Prince to escape before it happened, his life was probably gone. Since things had reached this point, what was there to be afraid of? Thus, he straightened his body and looked at Fan Xian without saying a word. However, the thick sense of guilt in his eyes could not be shaken off. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian didn't say anything. He also didn't take out a sword in a rage to chop off his head. Fan Xian only sighed and waved his hand. Alone, he walked toward the outside of the Eastern Palace. His back appeared somewhat lonely and desolate. Hongzhu stared in a daze at Fan Xian's back. For some reason, he began to cry again. Fan Xian walked out of the front door of the Eastern Palace. He could no longer hear Hongzhu's cries. His anger, for no reason, lessened greatly. However, his heart was somewhat empty. He waved his hand to summon his subordinate and ordered him to escort all of the serving girls and eunuchs in the Eastern Palace and Guangxin Palace to the Cold Palace area in the Qin Corridor. Then, he walked alone into the darkness of the royal palace. Hongzhu's temporary soft-heartedness had brought irreparable damage to his plan. In that instant, the angry Fan Xian indeed had the urge to kill. However, this urge immediately disappeared because he heard the words, "Xiao, When he was in Hangzhou, he had thought about what kind of effect that serving girl's death would have on Hongzhu's state of mind. From the beginning, he knew that Hongzhu was not a normal eunuch. He was a loyal and affectionate eunuch. Otherwise, Fan Xian wouldn't have entrusted so many important matters to him. However, Fan Xian had not thought that Hongzhu would be so affectionate. How could he be soft-hearted in such an important matter as the change in the palace? From this, it could be seen that the Crown Prince was a generous and affectionate person. Furthermore, Hongzhu, who had secrets, had perhaps developed some different feelings for the pitiful Empress in the Eastern Palace during the months the Crown Prince had been banished from Nanzhao. Hongzhu was an affectionate eunuch and had feelings for Fan Xian. That was why he had taken such a great risk to stir up chaos in the palace and help him enter the palace. He had feelings for the Crown Prince and for the Empress. That was why he had let go at the last moment. Humans had always been complicated creatures, particularly a eunuch like Hongzhu who was more like a scholar than a scholar. Perhaps I am too heartless to think that people could be so affectionate, Fan Xian thought to himself. Involuntarily, he thought of Su Maokai of the Jiaozhou Navy. A self-mocking smile rose to the corners of his lips. Su Maokai and Hongzhu were the two deepest nails he had planted in the Qin court. It was during this world-shaking court chaos that these two nails had their own thoughts and brought great harm to Fan Xian's plan. If it wasn't for Su Maokai, Fan Xian would not have been able to escape from the deep sea under Dong Mountain. If it wasn't for Hongzhu, Fan Xian wouldn't even have been able to enter the back palace. Thus, he knew he had no right to blame these trusted aides. He couldn't bear to kill Hongzhu and couldn't bear to blame Hongzhu. He only thought helplessly that in terms of moving people with emotions, the Crown Prince had already trained himself to be more powerful than him. The Crown Prince occasionally had true emotions, while he was a hypocrite to the end. With the help of the Overwatch Council subordinates, the Imperial Army had already purged the back palace. The internal guards had all been captured. They shouldn't be able to raise any more waves. Fan Xian returned to Hongguang Palace with a heavy expression. He didn't go in to see the Empress Dowager or comfort the third prince's family. He only gave a few orders in a low voice to Jinggu, who was standing guard outside the palace. Jing Ji's expression changed slightly. It was as if he had not thought that the commissioner would be considering the problem of failure in the midst of such a great victory. However, he didn't ask anything. Stretching out his right palm, he pressed the silver mask on his face tightly and knelt on one knee to accept the order. He then led some of the Black Knight aces out of the palace. The safety control of Hongguang Palace was handed over to the Imperial Army. The two masterminds of the first palace chaos in the history of Qing Kingdom finally met on the tall palace walls about half an hour after the signal arrow shot into the sky. Fan Xian silently bowed to the fully armored Great Prince. The Great Prince's expression was heavy. Although he was wearing armor, he still solemnly returned the bow. The night wind suddenly arrived and made the Great Prince's large red cloak flap loudly in the wind. It made the black Overwatch Council robes on Fan Xian's body stiff as if they had been washed. The nervous patrolling Imperial soldiers on the palace walls looked at this scene and couldn't help but feel admiration. Suddenly, an indescribable confidence welled up in them. In the first year of the Qing calendar, the Great Prince had led an army on an expedition to the west. His reputation had gradually risen, and he had never tasted defeat. After Fan Xian took control of the Overwatch Council, he seemed to have become the second Qin Pingping. However, he was much more glamorous than Director Qin. These two princes were like the battle robes on their bodies, a blazing bright red and a cold pure black. With light and darkness working together, how many people in this world could stand up to them? Fan Xian and the Great Prince straightened their bodies and didn't say anything. They came to the outside of the corner tower and watched the calm square at the foot of the tall palace walls. The faint sounds of killing came from the distance and a few eye-catching fires in the distance. The two of them didn't need to say anything. Accurately speaking, after the Dong Mountain incident, the two of them had never met or spoken. However, they had single-handedly brought about today's palace chaos. This relied on the trust and confidence the two of them had in each other. This kind of tacit understanding was not based on profit. Rather, it was based on history. In the emperor's family, these two princes had both been humiliated and neglected. Their mothers and elders had once fought side by side. Now, these two children were finally beginning to fight side by side. Of the 3,000 imperial soldiers, 1,000 were stationed in the palace, 1,000 were on the palace walls, and another 1,000 were already riding toward the depths of Jingdo. They had to take control of all of Jingdo before daybreak. It was indeed too difficult for 1,000 people to take control of Jingdo. If they added on the 1,000 Overwatch Council officials Fan Xian had purposely left outside the palace as helpers, it would go much more smoothly. "We have to capture them before daybreak," the Great Prince said coldly. The "them" in these words referred to the Crown Prince, his mother, and the eldest princess, Li Yunrui. Of the 1,000 imperial soldiers responsible for sweeping through the area, at least 3 small groups of riders were following the route of the laundry and desperately searching for the people who had escaped from the palace. Fan Xian was silent. The moment he learned that the Crown Prince and eldest princess had escaped the palace, he had already given the order. The secret agents and swordsmen of the Overwatch Council were also working hard in Jingdo. However, he knew that just like how it was difficult for the eldest princess to catch him when he was hiding in the vast sea of residences in Jingdo, it would also be difficult for him to catch them. This kind of thing required luck. What was disadvantageous to Fan Xian and the Great Prince was that they only had 6 hours before daybreak. "Everything is fine in Hongguang Palace." Fan Xian didn't answer the Great Prince's question. His eyes looked at the soldiers below the palace walls and changed the subject. "The Empress Dowager is fine." The Great Prince furrowed his brows and didn't say anything. The Great Prince had always been a rough and generous filial person, so it was impossible for him to do the things that Fan Xian could do. Even hearing the Empress Dowager's name made his mood drop a little. He felt a little uncomfortable. Fan Xian gazed at him with a slight smile. It was as if he could see through the shadow in his heart. He said, "The struggle for imperial power has always been a matter of life and death. We are only carrying out the emperor's posthumous edict. The history books will give you the evaluation you deserve. I don't care about that. The great prince shook his head and faced the night wind high above the palace walls. In a quiet voice, he said, "There's no need to say any more. Since father has given you full authority to handle this matter in the posthumous edict, I believe you can handle it well. I have confidence in you." If he didn't have confidence, the always filial great prince would not risk Lady Ning's life and raise an army to rebel. But, can you give me confidence? Fan Xian looked at the imperial soldiers that appeared sparse compared to the vast royal palace and sighed. There were only 1,000 soldiers around the royal palace. No matter what, it was not enough to give one a strong psychological support. The great prince understood what he was worried about. After a moment of silence, he said, "Father went to Dong Mountain and took away a group of imperial soldiers. Tonight, another group was lost. Don't worry, when used to defend a city, it is always 1 against 3, particularly in a place like the royal palace. 1 against 4 is fine. But the royal palace is very big. It is difficult to take care of it all." Fan Xian lowered his head and calculated. If the eldest princess and crown prince are actually allowed to escape Jingdo and meet with the Jingdo garrison, how many soldiers can the old Qin family move into the capital? 10,000 people of the Jingdo garrison. Since the great prince had raised an army, he had calculated the military power inside and outside Jingdo clearly. If we combine our forces, there will be 5,000 people. We should be able to hold them off. My people cannot be used to guard the palace. Fan Xian shook his head and raised his right arm to point at the dark sea of residences in Jingdo. They only have power in there. He turned his head to look at the side of the great prince's face and said with slight worry, "You've forgotten one thing. The second prince is not in the palace. He moved quickly and has probably already sneaked out of the city. Do you not need to consider Yi Zhong's subordinates? Furthermore, the army in the old Qin family's hands is not just the Jingdo garrison." The corners of the great prince's eyes twitched. If the Yi and Qin families truly joined hands to attack, even if the royal palace suddenly produced another 3,000 imperial soldiers, he would not have much confidence. Furthermore, the royal palace is an isolated palace. It is not like the large counties that have provisions. If the palace is surrounded by an army, how many days can you and I hold out? The great prince suddenly turned and stared into Fan Xian's eyes. What exactly do you want to say? Of course, I know the royal palace is not easy to defend, but why do we have to defend the palace and not the city? Defend the city. None of the 13 city gate guards have fallen into our hands. We have no idea which of the 9 city gates will be gently knocked open by the eldest princess, just like how I knocked open the door to the back palace. Don't hide it from me, the great prince said. You cannot give up on the city gate guards. Your people have already gone to the city gate guards. The spy the eldest princess buried in the city gate guards last night has already been killed by you. Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly and said, "The Overwatch Council is not an immortal. It is impossible for them to dig out all of the eldest princess spies. Furthermore, we have to plan for the worst. If the Empress Dowager's edict is unable to subdue Commander Zhang of the city gate guards, you and I have to be prepared to be trapped by the army in the palace. I only want to know how many days it will take for the Qin family's army to enter the capital. Yi Zhong has received the edict to return to Dingzhou. Even if he stops halfway, it will still take some time for him to reach the capital. If we only count the Jingdo garrison, it will arrive in a day," Fan Xian calmly said. The Qin family's army will arrive in about 4 days. It should be around the time Yi Zhong returns to the capital. The great prince did not ask why Fan Xian understood the Qin family's arrangements so clearly. He believed that the Overwatch Council had spies in the Qin family's army, just like in the Imperial Army. If Fan Xian had not pointed out the targets earlier, the purge earlier would not have been so easy. You can control the city gate guards. The Great Prince looked into Fan Xian's eyes and suddenly retorted. If you can't, you wouldn't dare to act. Thus, I am very curious as to what considerations you have for saying these things to me now. Fan Xian fell silent. Earlier, Jinggu brought your council order to me and moved 200 horses. He then left the palace and disappeared. The Great Prince looked at him coldly and said, "Don't tell me you don't have any thoughts." Fan Xian suddenly smiled and said, "Actually, I wanted to say, let's run." A muffled slap rang out. The furious Great Prince slammed his palm against the bricks of the royal palace. Lowering his voice, he said angrily, "Run. You're crazy." Fan Xian smiled bitterly and said, "I seem to have indeed gone crazy. Where can we run to?" "I was just joking." "Don't get so worked up, all right." "What kind of joke is this? Everyone's emotions are so tense. What's there to be afraid of if I joke a little to ease the emotions?" Fan Xian's words were not just a joke. If this had been in the past, perhaps he would have run a long time ago when the situation was reversed for his own safety. This conversation made it very clear that if the Crown Prince and eldest princess slipped out of Jingdo, the seemingly good situation would be destroyed in an instant. The Great Prince suddenly sighed and patted his shoulder heavily. "You've never led an army before. You've never seen what a true battlefield is like, so it's not strange for you to have such thoughts." As if to increase Fan Xian's confidence, the Great Prince said in a low voice, "With your people helping control the city gate guards, even if there are 4,000 people, I can still hold Jingdo for 10 days. Below the royal palace, Overwatch Council officials guarded a row of carriages as they approached the palace gates. The Great Prince narrowed his eyes and watched as the officials who had been tortured by the Crown Prince got off the carriages. With this group of officials here, how can we escape? How can we have the heart to escape? Fan Xian was silent and nodded. "Based on what you say, open a court conference today, announce the posthumous edict, and depose the Crown Prince." The Great Prince furrowed his brows and said, "Send out orders in all directions and order the 4 armies to return as quickly as possible. The 3 armies are far away on the border and will not be able to return to the capital within 10 days. If you and I send orders to return to the Yanjing camp." Fan Xian's heart chilled slightly. "I'm afraid you and I will become the sinners of the Qin kingdom." Fan Xian was worried about none other than the unfathomable emperor of northern Qi. Information traveled too slowly in this world. Fan Xian knew that he had killed the governor of the northern expedition camp and the fate of 5,000 soldiers at the foot of Dong Mountain was unknown. If the royal palace was in chaos right now and he used the title of regent to move the army stationed in Yanjing back, it would probably fall into the northern Qi emperor's calculations. He was afraid that before the Yanjing camp could return to the capital in time to suppress the Yi and Qin families, the northern army would move south. After experiencing so many things, Fan Xian knew that the northern Qi emperor was the most powerful figure in the world. Since he had secretly communicated with the eldest princess and participated in the inside story of Dong Mountain, he would not pass up such a great opportunity. Thus, the Yanjing camp could not be moved. The Great Prince's expression also became heavy. He knew that Fan Xian's worry was very reasonable. 10 days. We can only hold out for 10 days at most. If we can't move troops back to the capital to rescue the emperor. He suddenly smiled and looked at Fan Xian. "Looks like what you said is reasonable. Our best choice is indeed to escape earlier tonight." After these words were said, Fan Xian paused. Immediately, the two of them met each other's eyes and began to laugh loudly for no reason. The laughter traveled far from the palace walls, startling the scholars Shu and Hu at the palace gates below to raise their heads and look. They could faintly make out that it was the great prince and Fan Xian. The two scholars couldn't help but feel slightly more at ease. They thought that for the two of them to be able to laugh so happily at this moment, it looked like the situation was set. No one knew how much helplessness and bitterness there was in Fan Xian and the great prince's laughter. However, the two of them, with great tacit understanding, did not bring up the matter of the palace being evacuated again. Since the two of them were already standing on the palace walls, there was no reason for them to continue running. Today, the great unification will be decided. The posthumous edict will be sent to the streets of Jingdo to calm the hearts of the people. The edict will be sent to each province. After the laughter stopped, Fan Xian gazed at the great prince and said with a slight smile, "Use the Empress Dowager's edict to stabilize the city gate guards and then take control. You said you could stop the army for 10 days. I will give you 10 days. It will definitely last for 10 days." The great prince gripped the sword at his waist tightly. His expression was resolute. He thought to himself, the royal palace will be broken in 10 days. Why does Fan Xian care so much about this time? You must fight for these 10 days for me. Fan Xian coughed gently and took out a pungent pill from his clothes. With a calm expression, he said, "Although I've never been in command of an army, I know that the most important people in an army are the generals of all levels. Think about it. If the commander, deputy general, and colonel all died, what would become of this rebel army? A plate of scattered sand. Defeated without attacking." The great prince furrowed his brows slightly and looked at Fan Xian. He thought that if the generals of the rebel army all died mysteriously within 10 days, Jingdo would be able to be held. However, no matter how skilled the Overwatch Council was in assassinations or how skilled you were in poisons, it would be impossible to accomplish such a heaven-defying thing among thousands of soldiers and horses. Fan Xian did not answer his question. He continued calmly and said, "If even the crown prince and eldest princess suddenly died, what reason do you think this rebel army has to exist?" The great prince gazed at him with confusion. He wondered if Fan Xian was sick. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, "The reason I haven't run and am willing to defend this isolated city with you is not because I have great courage. Rather, it is because I have never lost confidence. However, after this matter, I'm afraid I won't have good days." The great prince didn't understand. Naturally, he didn't know what Fan Xian meant. If Fan Xian truly brought out the heavy killing machine, who knew what path history would take in the future? Suddenly, there was a commotion outside the palace doors. A group of riders arrived in a cloud of dust. It seemed that they had captured someone. The great prince looked over and saw that the person captured was a woman. It was too far away, so he couldn't see her face clearly. However, she seemed to be wearing the clothing of a common serving girl. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and faintly said, "Our luck has always been good. Look, we've already captured the Empress. Are the crown prince and eldest princess far away?" After saying this, he turned and walked down the wide stone steps. He prepared to welcome the old officials who had suffered and prepare for the court conference the next day. He wondered what kind of crime he should arrange for the crown prince and eldest princess. At the same time, he prepared to comfort the poor, stupid, and unlucky empress. Should I lock the empress and Hongzhu together? A strange thought suddenly rose in Fan Xian's heart. He thought to himself that he was actually quite sentimental. Walking on the stone steps, his cough grew more and more severe. It seemed that the pill with the pungent smell of medicine he had eaten earlier had no effect. He leaned against the wall beside the stone steps and calmed his mind. He took out another pill from his clothes and stuffed it into his mouth. He chewed hard a few times and swallowed it. The pungent smell was the smell of ephedra leaves. Ever since Fan Xian and the brothers of the Third Bureau had developed this kind of pill, it was the second time someone had taken it. The medicinal power of this pill was too tyrannical. The ephedra leaves were similar to stimulants. It could easily make one's mind become absent-minded and mess up one's xinqi. The first time he had taken this kind of medicine was also Fan Xian. It had been a few years ago beside the precipice of Shi Mountain in northern Qi, when he had faced the combined attack of Lang Tiao and Friar He. Fan Xian panted heavily a few times and calmed his mind. After escaping from Dong Mountain, he had been scratched by Yi Liuyun's sword intent. At the same time, he had been chased for hundreds of li by Yan Xiaoyi. In the end, he had been shot in the side of his heart. His injuries were serious. Unable to receive good treatment, his entire body was at the end of its flight. Although he had rested in Lady Sun's boudoir for a number of days, his present realm was actually only 80% of his peak. In order to break into the palace, he had no choice but to take this harmful medicine again. Only then could he ensure that his valiant strength could be fully demonstrated. The first time he had taken this medicine was for Xiao An and the secret of the temple in the old man's mouth. The second time he had taken this medicine was for breaking into the palace and for the great land of the Qin kingdom. There were many things in the world that were more important than health. Fan Xian thought to himself as he walked down with a slightly pale face. Jingdou was in chaos. Compared to the Ministry of Justice and the Jingdou government's victory without a fight, the attack on the eldest princess manor had sunk into a bitter battle from the beginning. The clumps of fire that Fan Xian and the great prince had seen on the palace walls were a vicious plan the Overwatch Council had been forced to use when they attacked. Fortunately, the eldest princess was not in the manor. The chief strategist of Xinyang, Yuan Hongdao, who was supposed to be in charge of the defense, seemed to have been scared out of his wits by the attack. Thus, after the Overwatch Council paid the price of dozens of bodies, the aces and serving girls in the manor were finally turned into porcupines by crossbow bolts and zombies by poison. The Overwatch Council officials charged in. The leading head of the First Bureau, Mu Feng, had a deep gash on his left arm. Fresh blood flowed freely, but his face was indifferent. He viciously placed the short sword across Yuan Hongdao's neck. He was Mu Tai's nephew and Fan Xian's direct subordinate in the First Bureau. For this kind of life and death struggle, he could not show any mercy. What he found strange was that the eldest princess's strategist, who was under his control, did not show much fear. On the contrary, he was filled with panic. Yuan Hongdao gazed at Mu Feng and anxiously said, "I have something important to report to the Duke of Donbua." Chapter 557. He then said an important question. After combing through the contents of this scroll, he realized that he had made a big mistake and was very ashamed. In the book, the Minister of Appointments, Yan Hangshu, had already left his post when the emperor first attacked the eldest princess. Even if the eldest princess reappointed him after her rebellion, he should not have risen so quickly and appeared in Taiji Palace to speak up for the crown prince. This is a big mistake. I will slowly correct it. I apologize again. Mu Feng narrowed his eyes. He didn't know why this old man in front of him, who looked like a scholar, dared to make such an absurd request. A captured traitor wanted to see his commissioner. Even if he was the top strategist in Xinyang, on such a tense night, he could only be thrown into prison and temporarily keep his life. In his heart, Yuan Hongdao probably knew that he had no way out, so he wanted to use his silver tongue to see Fan Xian and persuade the commissioner to let him live. However, Mu Feng, an official of the Overwatch Council, loathed from the bottom of his heart these so-called strategists who only knew how to talk and plot. There were no relevant instructions in the orders he had received. He would not give Yuan Hongdao any more time to struggle. Seeing Yuan Hongdao open his mouth in panic to speak, Mu Feng was increasingly sure of his judgment. It looked like this old man was extremely afraid of death. He furrowed his brows and did not give Yuan Hongdao another chance to speak. He pulled back his short sword and then smashed out with his fist, directly creating a bruise on Yuan Hongdao's temple and knocking him out. Yuan Hongdao only felt a ringing in his head. His vision blurred, and he fainted to the ground. In the instant before he fainted, his heart was filled with anger and helplessness. As the only remaining member of the Overwatch Council's first batch of spies, he knew very well how strict the Overwatch Council's missions were. Since this Overwatch Council official did not know his identity, he would choose such a crude and simple method to shut him up. In the entire world, only 3 people knew that he, the chief strategist of Xinjiang, was a member of the Overwatch Council. One was the Emperor, who had already died on Dong Mountain. Another was Director Qin, who was rumored to have been poisoned and was being pursued by the Qin family's army. Another was Yan Ruohai. As for the serving girl who had once met him, she had already died in an accident. Yuan Hongdao was unable to prove his identity. Mu Feng strictly followed the rules of the council and did not give him this opportunity. Perhaps this was the common sorrow of the sleuths in the countless worlds from ancient times until now. The possibility of them falling at the hands of their comrades was often greater than them revealing their identities and being silenced by their enemies. He only felt some regret and a strong sense of worry. Mu Feng did not know that the person who had fainted in front of him was his senior, nor did he know how much unknown danger his simple punch would bring to Jingdo in the following days. He simply ordered his subordinates to clean up the eldest princess courtyard. He then escorted the remaining captives and locked them into the Overwatch Council's dark prison. Fan Xian took 2 ephedra pills in a row. The powerful medicinal power covered his eyes with a faint and ominous red. However, in the dark of the night, it was difficult to see clearly. He walked to the foot of the palace walls and respectfully welcomed the officials the Crown Prince had locked up in the Ministry of Justice's prison. He held Shu Wu and Hu the scholar's hands. His thin lips opened slightly, but he was so moved he couldn't say anything. There was no need to fake anything. Fan Xian was indeed moved that the civil officials of the Qin kingdom would stand on his side at such a critical moment. Although he had the emperor's posthumous edict in his hands and his father-in-law in Wuzhou had, at the most critical moment, finally brought out his most deeply hidden students and old friends in court. He knew how much courage it took to oppose the crown prince's ascension in Taiji Palace. If Li Qingqian was as cold-blooded as him or the second prince, these officials would probably have long become dozens of heroic spirits in the royal palace. Shu Wu and Hu the scholar didn't say anything. They only bowed toward Fan Xian. Shu Wu was the first person in the world to see the posthumous edict. Hu the scholar also knew the contents of the edict. He knew that although Fan Xian did not have the title of regent, he had the reality of regent. The emperor had given the power to choose an heir to the throne to Sir Fan Jr. This kind of trust and entrustment was rarely seen in thousands of years. Time is tight. Fan Xian knew that this was not the time to exchange words of admiration. He faced the officials in the hall and said in an even voice, "I'll have to trouble all of you to rest here for now. In a short while, a royal doctor will come to treat you. Go do your own things, Duke," Hu the scholar said warmly. "At a time like this, we don't have much use. The flag has been waved, and the cry has been made. If those rebels and traitors still do not stop, then the Duke of Danbo will need to wield the Emperor's sword and kill them one by one." Although his words were light, his support for Fan Xian was completely clear. Fan Xian said, "I don't know how many other important matters require your support." Presently, the Empress Dowager already knows of the Crown Prince and eldest princess's evil actions. In her heartache, she is sick in bed and has entrusted all the affairs of the court to you too. I hope you too can temporarily endure the pain of your skin and stand well for the Qin kingdom. I dare not do as you wish, Shu Wu replied in a raspy voice. The dozens of officials behind him also raised their hands. These civil officials knew that the situation in Jingdo was still complicated. They had to hurry and settle the matter. As for the news of the Empress Dowager being sick in bed, these officials unconsciously filtered it out of their minds. No one was stupid, particularly these civil officials. They all knew that Fan Xian planned to use the Empress Dowager to control the various yamens. Presently, he had the previous emperor's posthumous edict in his hands, the Empress Dowager, and the support of various officials. Jingdo, at least on the surface, appeared to be stable. The officials began to rest in a side room in Taiji Palace. Although this place was much better than the prison of the Ministry of Justice, it was still cold and cheerless. The floor was icy and hard. Everyone knew that before the court conference began, it was best for them not to rush to enjoy it. Hu and Shu the scholars followed Fan Xian into the royal study. In this room where the Qing emperor presided over state affairs day after day and examined memorials, the lights were still very bright. In front of these two scholars, Fan Xian no longer needed to hide anything. Worry naturally appeared on his calm face. After some conversation, Hu and Shu the scholars' expressions also became heavy. They had thought that Fan Xian had completely controlled the situation. They had not expected that the crown prince and eldest princess would disappear. Everything will be done according to ancestral precedent, Hu the scholars suddenly said calmly. Amidst the silence, Hu the scholars suddenly opened his mouth and calmly said, no matter what kind of preposterous and shameless things these rebels and traitors will do, presumably, it will not surprise us. Although we cannot immediately end the current chaotic situation, the court conference must begin today. The crimes of the crown prince and eldest princess must be clearly announced to the world. Shu Wu cautiously said, clearly announced to the world, how will the court give an explanation to the people? Hu the scholar calmly said, orthodoxy and righteousness are the explanations. If they act in the dark and don't say it clearly, it will not be appropriate. Fan Xian nodded. He thought that Hu the scholar's insistence on immediately calling the court conference at such a complicated time was very close to his own thoughts. It was because they didn't know whether or not the crown prince and eldest princess would escape Jingdo that the people in the palace had to immediately depose the crown prince and smoothly pass down the Qing royal family's great unity. Then, they would announce it to the world. After the discussion was set, Hu and Shu the scholars began to personally write letters, sketching out what had happened in Jingdo. Then, Fan Xian solemnly stamped the royal seal the emperor had entrusted to him. He then stamped the Empress Dowager's seal he had taken from Hongguang Palace and signed his own name. After sealing these dozen letters, Fan Xian handed them to his trusted aide. Through the Overwatch Council's secret mail route, they were sent to the governor's manor of the Qing Kingdom's 7 roads. At the same time, they were sent to the 5 road armies stationed on the border. However, Fan Xian knew that the letter sent to the northern expedition camp in Cangzhou was probably completely useless. When Fan Xian stamped the Empress Dowager's seal, Hu and Shu the scholars met each other's eyes and shook their heads slightly. They thought to themselves that Sir Fan Jr. was not afraid of anything in front of them. He was truly daring. A dozen messengers charged out of the royal palace at the fastest speed, accompanied by the sound of horse hooves. They charged into the streets of Jingdo that seemed to never see daylight. Mingling with the chaotic sounds of killing in all directions and the sometimes burning and sometimes extinguishing fires, they rode in the direction of the city gates. They carried an important mission on their shoulders. Can they leave the city? Hu the scholar suddenly watched Fan Xian quietly. He wanted to get a confirmation from Fan Xian's mouth as to who was in control of the 13 city gate guards. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said, there shouldn't be any problems. My people went at the beginning. Who the scholar knew that Fan Xian never spoke empty words. Since he had already sent people, he would certainly send the most capable people for important positions like the 13 city gate guards. Fan Xian walked out of the royal study and waved his hand to summon Eunuch Dai, who was standing guard outside. After a moment of silence, he said, "Is there a problem with the Empress?" The situation in the palace had changed a long time ago. Eunuch Hong and Eunuch Yao had followed the emperor to worship heaven and had probably long died on Dong Mountain. Eunuch Ho had been coldly and mercilessly shot to death by Fan Xian with a crossbow. Hong Zhu, who had enjoyed limitless glory these 2 years, had been imprisoned in the cold palace with the eunuchs and serving girls in the eastern palace. Eunuch Dai had privately opened the palace doors and performed a great service. He was also someone Fan Xian trusted. Naturally, he resumed his position as the head eunuch. Presently, the rear palace was watched by the imperial army. The internal affairs were all handled by Eunuch Dai. He bowed and replied respectfully, "Following your orders, she has already been escorted into the cold palace. The Empress's body is fine, but her spirit is a bit weary." Fan Xian nodded. After escaping in the middle of the night and then being captured, no one would be able to endure such mental torture. The power of the medicine gradually weakened. Fan Xian felt a bit tired. Although he knew it was not time to rest, he still tiredly leaned against the pillar outside the royal study. Looking at the square beside the palace, he was silent and didn't speak. He had not lied to Hu the scholar. It was just as the great prince had said. From the beginning, he could not truly give up on the city gate department. However, he had too few people in Jingdo. There were thousands of soldiers in the city gate department. It was impossible to use such violent methods to resolve it. Thus, he had made a copy of the emperor's posthumous edict and given it to the person he trusted the most. He had confidence in that person and in Commander Zhang of the City Gate Department. Commander Zhang was a true blue royalist. After the Qing emperor was assassinated, he only listened to the Empress Dowager's orders. Thus, he was able to forcefully block the Yi and Qin families' armies outside Jingdo. No matter how he considered it, the City Gate Department should make a choice that suited Fan Xian's interests. Fan Xian didn't know that the pillar he was leaning against had once been the place where the emperor and Chen Pingping had spoken twice. He also didn't know that a person called Yuan Hongdao had already been knocked unconscious by his loyal subordinate and locked up in the Overwatch Council's prison. He was only worried about Wan He, De Bao, and his father in King Jing's manor. He still hadn't received any news. He didn't know if anyone could rescue his wife and brother-in-law or how dangerous King Jing's manor was right now. When the white-clothed Sir Yen Jr. came out of the back garden of the Jingdo government, Fan Xian's operation to break into the palace had not yet begun. Mu Tai, who was responsible for subduing the Jingdo government, was still lying in ambush in the dark outside the manor. He tidied his white clothes and walked into an alley. He still had a lingering sense of leisure as he turned his head to glance at the night sky. A firework bloomed in the night sky. It was very beautiful. The usually cold Yen Bingyun looked at the firework that disappeared in a flash in the night sky and smiled. He knew that Fan Xian had already made his move, so he had to hurry. He didn't wear night clothes. Instead, he wore an eye-catching white robe that stood out against the darkness around him. His mission at the City Gate Department was not to assassinate. It was to subdue. Yen Bingyun knew how to win the trust of loyal soldiers. Arriving at the City Gate Department Yamen, Yen Bingyun calmly arrived at the Yamen under the escort of dozens of spear-wielding soldiers and waited for Commander Zhang to receive him. Sir Yen is currently a wanted criminal by the court. You are quite daring to come to see me. Commander Zhang of the 13 city gate departments, the key figure in controlling the opening and closing of Jingdo's 9 city gates, slowly walked out of the doorway and looked at the white-clothed Yan Bingyun with furrowed brows. Chapter 558. Another blunder. I actually made the link to the fist aura into Evil Ming. Of course, both books were written by the same person. The book number has been corrected. It should be 10400013. I also don't understand why I would bring up Evil Ming's link. What a head-scratcher. Commander of the 13 city gate guards, Zhang Deqing, 3rd level. His personnel files were in the Bureau of Military Affairs. His manor was in the south of the city. His servants were chosen by the Overwatch Council. His salary was taken from the internal court. He had never gone to the Bureau of Military Affairs for a meeting. He hadn't even taken a step into the old military yamen. Nominally, he was a soldier. His relationship with the Qing military was like that of a widow and a father-in-law. Even if you beat him to death, he wouldn't dare get too close. His family, colleagues, and the people he socialized with were all people the emperor allowed him to socialize with. The reason for this was because the emperor always kept the keys to the 9 city gates on his belt. Thus, the Qing emperor had to keep his head on his belt. If Zhang Deqing dared to rebel, the emperor had many ways to make him die a tragic death. However, no one thought that Zhang Deqing would rebel. It wasn't just because his family had been loyal for generations. It wasn't just because even his wife was the descendant of generations of loyal officials. Over the years, people had become used to Zhang Deqing's way of doing things. He ate the emperor's food and listened to the emperor's words. Sir Zhang would not wish the emperor wisdom when he ate. He would also not occasionally find an excuse to enter the palace to flatter the emperor. However, he carried out any of the emperor's edicts with unusual firmness, including that night many years ago when Jingdo bled with blood. Counting on one's fingers, Sir Zhang Deqing was like Dingzhou Zizhong. They were both elders who had managed Jingdo for nearly 20 years. For such a person who was as clean as tofu and the sensitive position he managed, no power dared to come into contact with him. Even the second prince, who had once fought with the crown prince for power, did not dare. Coming into contact with Zhang Deqing was the same as touching his father's crotch. Thus, Zhang Deqing was like an invisible person in officialdom. Unless it was a critical moment like this, no one would think of him. After the Qing emperor had died heroically on Dong Mountain, Sir Zhang Deqing's loyalty had quickly and accurately shifted to the Empress Dowager. His figure was revealed in an instant, and it was especially dazzling. He was loyal to the Empress Dowager not because she was the emperor's birth mother but because the emperor had announced to the world that the present Qing kingdom was being ruled by the Empress Dowager. These two young officials of the Overwatch Council could guess that the emperor must have other ways to control Zhang Deqing. However, the emperor had already passed, so they had no way to start. They could only proceed from the word of loyalty. Zhang, Fan, Zhang, Yan said. Yan, Zhang, Yan, Zhang Deqing was already old, and the bags under his eyes were a little thick. Perhaps it was because he had been worried these days and hadn't had a good rest. At this moment, the pupils above the eye bags were shining with sadness, anger, and many other emotions. In the yamen of the 13 city gate guards, Yan Bingyun arrived alone. After handing over the copy of the posthumous edict, he quietly waited for Zhang Deqing's choice. To be able to copy the Qing Emperor's posthumous edict in such a short amount of time proved that the Overwatch Council's skill level had taken a qualitative leap after successfully forging the old Ming master's will. It also proved that Fan, at this moment, was a revolutionary rebellious spirit that was not afraid of boiling water. It also proved that although Sir Yan Jr. was loyal to the monarch and loved his country, he was not mechanically bureaucratic in the details. This so-called posthumous edict was actually a letter the emperor had written to the Empress Dowager in an indifferent tone that seemed to have seen through the affairs of the world the night Dong Mountain was surrounded. In the letter, he mentioned the matter of dethroning the crown prince, as well as the sinister roles the crown prince and eldest princess played in the siege of Dong Mountain. At the same time, he clearly stated that after Fan Xian returned to Jingdo, the power of regent would be given to him. Furthermore, to everyone's disbelief, he would be given the power to choose the next monarch of the Qin kingdom. 2 lines of tears flowed down from Zhang Deqing's eyes. Although he had long known that the emperor had died on Dong Mountain, seeing the emperor's handwriting, this third-level commander of the city gate guard still couldn't stop the emotions in his heart from surging. Has the Empress Dowager seen this posthumous edict? Zhang Deqing suddenly raised his head and stared into Yan Bingyun's eyes. Sir Yan Jr. was increasingly certain that the plan he and Fan Xian had come up with would succeed. No matter how one looked at it, this commander famed for his loyalty in court would stand on his side. He quietly said, "The Empress has already seen it." Then what about the fireworks and arrows in the palace earlier? Zhang Deqing stared at Yan Bingyun. The posthumous edict orders Sir Fan Jr. to assist the Empress Dowager in getting rid of the rebels. Yan Bingyun was not flustered. As long as Fan Xian's mission to break into the palace was successful and the crown prince and eldest princess were captured, there was no reason for the city gate guards to have any problems. The fireworks have already begun. I cannot rely on a posthumous edict to believe you, Zhang Deqing said. I want to see the Empress Dowager. Of course. Yan Bingyun's face was icy as he answered cleanly. He actually didn't know the situation in the palace. He didn't know whether the Empress Dowager was dead or alive. But, he had to answer confidently. You have been loyal for generations. In this time of danger for the Qin kingdom, you must act according to the previous emperor's posthumous edict. Yan Bingyun did not forget to attach each word to the emperor's posthumous edict. Back in the day, he had traveled around northern Qi under an alias. He was skilled in using money and power. He was also a powerful figure who could deceive people without paying with his life. However, these years, he had only done some desk work in the council and had been away from such dangerous work for too long. Tonight, he had single-handedly convinced the Jingdo magistrate. Now, he had convinced the commanders of the 13 city gate guards amidst a forest of guns. It could only be considered that he had returned to his old profession. There is chaos in the palace, Zhang Deqing said after a moment of silence. I need to enter the palace immediately. Yan Bingyun furrowed his brows. Zhang Deqing's gaze focused as if he had sensed something. Yan Bingyun coldly reprimanded, Sir Zhang, don't forget that the emperor has entrusted these 9 city gates to you. It is your duty to firmly guard the gates for Jingdo. After these words were said, Zhang Deqing fell silent again. It was as if he was considering something. A moment later, he said, Sir Yan, give me some time. Delay. Yan Bingyun faintly sensed something strange. Had Zhang Deqing not been convinced by this posthumous edict and still wanted to see the situation in Jingdo? He didn't know that the eldest princess and crown prince had already escaped the palace. If the 13 city gate guards temporarily remained neutral, it was not a result he could not accept. In fact, it was even better than what he had anticipated. Since he had to delay, then he would delay. Yan Bingyun calmly sat down in the city gate yamen. He sat calmly with a calm expression. Seeing his expression, Zhang Deqing couldn't help but be startled. It was as if he had not expected him to be so confident. However, no one expected that it would drag on for such a long time. Yan Bingyun was under house arrest in the city gate yamen. There was no hot tea to drink or music to listen to. It was indeed difficult to endure. Of course, the most difficult thing was the omnipresent pressure. He drank the northwest wind and heard the occasional sound of killing in Jingdo. Sometimes, he could even smell a faint burning smell. Someone had probably set something on fire. Zhang Deqing didn't have much time to sit with him. As the commander of the city gate guards, he had too many important things to take care of. He gripped the sword at his waist and walked in the darkness on the city walls. The blisters under his eyes had miraculously disappeared. A light like that of a hawk's flashed through his eyes as he stared at every movement in Jingdo. At the same time, he occasionally sent out orders to suppress his subordinates and strictly forbid them from participating in the coup in Jingdo. He only had 3,000 soldiers watch the 9 Jingdo city gates tightly. In his eyes, the so-called righteous power led by Fan Xian was actually a coup. Although, after reading the posthumous edict, he had to admit that Fan Xian had a righteous reputation, he still unconsciously thought that everyone who attacked the royal palace was a bad person. Compared to Shangjing in northern Qi, Qing Kingdom's Jingdo did not have as much history. However, it had more traces of the military. Although the city walls were not modeled, they were very thick. Although they were not as tall as the royal palace, if they were truly used for defense, the various configurations were much more powerful. Zhang Deqing stood on the city walls. It was as if he was drawing endless power from the thick stone and brick walls, giving him the courage to make certain choices. At a lookout, he stopped and gazed into the distance in the direction of the royal palace. The chaos in Jingdo gradually calmed. It seemed that the Jingdo government had already been subdued by Fan Xian. Bailiffs began to go out into the streets and sound gongs to calm the people. He did not know that the two masterminds of the Jingdo Palace rebellion, the Great Prince and Fan Xian, were also standing on the city walls and gazing into the distance in the direction of the city gates. A faint worry flashed through his eyes. If things continued to develop like this, he could only accept the posthumous edict. Perhaps this was not a bad choice. However, Zhang Deqing heard the sound of carriage wheels grinding against the stone road. The sound rang out clearly in his ears. It's the triangular stone road. It's near the city gates. Zhang Deqing was unusually familiar with the area around the city gates. He had managed for nearly 20 years. He was so familiar that he could even tell whether the carriage wheels were grinding over the stone road or the triangular stone road. He was silent for a moment. He then walked down the tall city walls and into the yamen of the city gate department. When the sound of the carriage rang out outside the city gates, Yan Bingyun had already stood up with a heavy expression. The soldiers around him responsible for guarding him became nervous. Pulling out their weapons, they surrounded him in the middle. Yan Bingyun's heart sank, not because he was surrounded by soldiers, but because of the sound of the carriage. In the middle of the night in Jingdo, who would ride a carriage near the city gates? The people of Jingdo had long experienced the court's overthrow. A commotion like the one tonight would not scare them enough to flee. Furthermore, the people were not stupid enough to sit in a carriage and wait to be tortured by the red-eyed soldiers. There was only one kind of person who wanted to leave the capital in a carriage. Zhang Deqing walked in. Looking at Yan Bingyun with a heavy expression, he said, "Excuse me, Sir Yan." He then shouted, "Take down this court criminal." Yan Bingyun's pupils constricted slightly. He didn't know why Zhang Deqing's attitude had changed so drastically. Had Zhang Deqing's mission to break into the palace failed? The soldiers surrounded him. Yan Bingyun did not resist. Everyone knew that the biggest difference between Sir Yan Jr. and Sir Fan Jr. was that his martial prowess was on the lower side. When he attacked, he did not have much killing power. Yan Bingyun would not risk his life. Zhang Deqing only wanted to take him down. If he resisted and these dozen long spears pierced into his body, it would not feel good. The city gate department did not have the Overwatch Council's steel finger gloves. Instead, they had a small shackle. After it locked onto a person's wrist, it was impossible to struggle free. After Yan Bingyun was tightly bound, Zhang Deqing let out a breath and looked with confusion at the dark night outside. Who would have thought that you would actually come alone? Zhang Deqing's brows were furrowed tightly. I don't know whether to say that Sir Fan Jr. is stupid or that you are too daring. Yan Bingyun was kicked to the ground and made a rare joke. Actually, this is just a problem of manpower. He paused and then said, I cannot imagine that I would misjudge a person. Zhang Deqing was silent for a moment and then said, the reason is simple. If you win, I will follow the edict. If you lose, what benefit is there for me to follow the edict? Yan Bingyun furrowed his brows and sighed a moment later. A loyal official, loyal official. How loyal? I am loyal to the emperor, but I will not be loyal to this posthumous edict whose authenticity is unknown. Zhang Deqing's expression was slightly ugly. It was as if he felt a glimmer of fear that he had disobeyed the emperor's posthumous edict. The commander of the city gate department thought to himself that if the emperor was still here, he would be a loyal official for a lifetime. However, the emperor was no longer here. Who would want to guard these 9 broken city gates for a lifetime? Yan Bingyun was silent. He had come to the city gate department to take a risk, but it was also based on his judgment of Zhang Deqing. He still could not convince himself why such a commander would so cleanly choose to stand against the posthumous edict. Had Fan Xian lost? Yan Bingyun's brows were still furrowed as if he was thinking of a difficult problem. At this moment, Zhang Deqing was only 3 steps away from him. Yan Bingyun's brows suddenly relaxed. A drop of cold sweat slid down from the corner of his brows. However, Zhang Deqing clearly heard a cracking sound, as if a table leg had been forcibly broken by someone. Yan Bingyun suddenly raised his head and said each word clearly, Commander of the 13 city gate guards, Zhang Deqing, has disobeyed the edict and aided in the chaos. All Qing citizens should be punished according to the emperor's posthumous edict. Zhang Deqing's gaze moved slightly. He didn't know who Yan Bingyun's words were meant for. At this moment, the people in the hall were all his trusted aides. No one would be stupid enough to attack. However, he felt a glimmer of strangeness in his heart. Unconsciously, he retreated, wanting to put some distance between him and the tightly bound Yan Bingyun. Someone moved. The person who moved was not Yan Bingyun. Rather, it was one of Zhang Deqing's trusted soldiers. After that person heard Yan Bingyun's words, his face darkened. Gritting his teeth, he raised the knife in his hand and brought it down toward the back of Zhang Deqing's head. Just as was said earlier, no matter how much the Qing emperor trusted Zhang Deqing's loyalty, he would always have spies in the city gate department. Most of these spies were sent out by the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian and Yan Bingyun could not come into contact with these spies, but Yan Bingyun was using the posthumous edict to gamble on the hot blood of these spies. Even if it was 1 in 10, it would still be very effective. The wind of the knife came down. Zhang Deqing's face darkened. Without turning his head, he raised his sword and swung it. With a crisp sound, he was forced to take a step forward. The knife of the Overwatch Council's secret agent behind him was also blocked. The long spear stabbed forward. In an instant, the secret agent's body was covered in fresh blood and died. Yan Bingyun also moved at this moment. When the drop of cold sweat dripped from his forehead, he had already moved. He gritted his teeth and forcefully snapped his left wrist in the middle. He was not a normal official or general. He was the successor commissioner of the Overwatch Council. Since he dared to come personally to the city gate department, he had confidence. The Overwatch Council had studied the tools of the city gate guards very thoroughly. In the end, they had finally discovered the problem with this flail. As long as someone was able to separate the entire wrist joint in a short amount of time and endure the splitting pain, they could pull the wrist out. Yan Bingyun was able to endure the pain and was willing to be ruthless to himself. When Zhang Deqing took a step closer to him, he had already charged up like a cheetah. With the flail in one hand, he viciously smashed it toward Zhang Deqing's head. A glimmer of fear flashed through Zhang Deqing's eyes. Perhaps betraying the emperor had made his state of mind unsteady. He did not dare to take this blow head-on and retreated in a panic. At this moment, the soldiers behind him had stabbed the Overwatch Council's secret agent to death and just happened to block his path of retreat. He could only rush wretchedly toward the door of the hall in an attempt to temporarily avoid this attack. Yan Bingyun floated up and gave chase like a cloud. Along the way, he flipped his wrist and snatched the sword from Zhang Deqing's hand. With a flash of green light, he chopped off the arm of an officer who had come to help. Like a maggot on a bone and a greedy cloud, Yan Bingyun did not fall a single step. He stuck close to Zhang Deqing's body and arrived at the door of the hole. Feeling the dense sword qi behind him, Zhang Deqing was frightened. He had not expected Yan Bingyun to have such delicate and ruthless sword skills. Yan Bingyun was not good at martial arts, but that was when compared to the freak Fan Xian. Once he exploded to kill, how could the most famous spy in the history of the Overwatch Council, Zhang Deqing, who had guarded the city gate for 20 years, stand up to him? The lightning-fast pursuit did not give the soldiers of the city gate guards any chance to react. The two of them had already reached the door of the hole. Bloody wounds appeared on Yan Bingyun's body. If Yan Bingyun had not tried to restrain him to control the city gate guards, he would probably have long lost his life. Suddenly, two rays of sharp qi shot toward Yan Bingyun's body. They were extremely powerful and abrupt. Yan Bingyun gave a muffled grunt and pulled back his sword to protect his chest. Blood seeped out of his nose and mouth. However, the sharp attack finally stopped. Zhang Deqing wretchedly rolled to a stop at someone's feet. It was possible to see the light-colored palace dress hidden under ordinary clothing. The calm eldest princess, Li Yunrui, smiled slightly at Yan Bingyun and said, "Under the protection of two aces of the Juanshang Conference, let me tell Sir Yan Jr. that the reason Deqing betrayed us is because he was originally one of us." A glimmer of disbelief and shock flashed through Yan Bingyun's eyes. Shortly after, it turned to dejection. His left hand had been crippled. Standing in the hall of the city gate guards in front of the pool of blood of that brave secret agent, he appeared very lonely. Chapter 559. At the end of last month, Baoyu's father's father said that it was okay not to read the book reviews. I deeply agree with him. Recently, I haven't read much, so I haven't added much. Please understand. The reason I haven't read it is because I have always been the kind of trash most easily affected by emotions. I can tolerate criticism and accept criticism, but that doesn't mean I like criticism, especially the glorious, correct, and great kind. Today, I drank some wine and couldn't resist reading it. Many negative emotions rose to the corners of my lips like a treacherous official smile. I was unable to be happy. Writing a novel is making up a story. Once I explain it, it will become too boring. I can't say it. You will understand later. Regardless of whether I like it or not, I have to write it like this. In this world, there is no work that everyone likes to see. After all, I am not the director of the Spring Festival Gala, and I do not plan on participating in the 5 ones. I understand that everyone likes this story, which is why they are discussing and criticizing it so seriously. However, I also hope that everyone can understand the irritation and unease of a person's body often staying at home and the mind often exploding. What I need the most right now is not advice or criticism, but the pleasure brought by praise or a calm space to write. These were some explanatory words shamelessly asking for applause. One of Yan Bingyun's hands was broken and hung weakly by his waist. He looked at the eldest princess. His gaze appeared dim. The dull pain in his chest let him know that he had already suffered internal injuries from the touch earlier. The aces of the Juanshan conference beside the eldest princess were not people he could stand against. At this moment, the 13 city gate guards had already been heavily surrounded by soldiers. The long spears were pointed at Xiaoyan. 2 of the Juanshan conference aces beside the eldest princess separated and quickly closed in on Yan Bingyun. The sharp blades in their hands gave off a deathly stillness that enveloped his entire body. If only the emperor had listened to Enji back then and cleaned out the Juanshan conference. Before his death, Yan Bingyun couldn't help but think of this. He knew he was no match for these Jianghu aces, so he didn't extravagantly beg the Temple of Heaven to give him a chance to escape. He only pulled out something from his clothes with a heavy expression. Since there was a change in the city gate department, he had to report Zhang Deqing's fatal betrayal to Fan Xian in the royal palace before he died. Yan Bingyun's index finger grabbed the ring of the arrow. Looking at the 2 black sword shadows that were getting closer and closer, his pupils shrank. He spat out a mouthful of turbid air, tightly pursed his lips, and forcefully pulled. With a hiss, the command arrow ignited, but it didn't rise into the air because a small force had struck his wrist. A wisp of warm liquid splashed onto the back of his hand, causing his heart to tremble. This command arrow flew out diagonally. It didn't fly very far before it shot into the chest of a city gate department soldier and exploded with a pop. Yan Bingyun didn't lower his head. From the corner of his eyes, he could see that his hand was covered in blood. When his index finger reached into the ring, fear appeared in the eyes of the Juanshan conference ace closest to him. It was as if he had seen something unusually terrifying. Then, a thin line of blood appeared on the ace's neck. The line of blood spread out in an instant and became a bloody gash. One could see the ace's ghastly white throat bone, unusually disgusting trachea, esophagus, and blurry flesh. With a crack, the ace charged in front of Yan Bingyun and knelt down with a thud. Jolted by the force of the attack, his throat, which had been sliced open, was powerless to hold on to his head. With the vertebrae at the back of his neck as the center, his head flipped weakly to his back. The upside-down, pale, dead face stared with wide eyes at the eldest princess and Zhang Deqing, who were protected by layers of aces and soldiers. Fresh blood sprayed out of his throat like a fountain and struck Yan Bingyun's hand, painting his entire hand a bright red. Coincidentally, it also prevented the arrow of command from rising into the sky. The other Juanshan conference ace who had charged over faced an even more wretched fate. He didn't charge in front of Yan Bingyun at all. His gaze only caught a faint shadow reflected by the torch passing in front of him. He felt a coldness at his throat. A delicate and lustreless sword stabbed out from behind him on the right. With unusual stability and ruthlessness, it pierced through his neck at high speed and came out from the other side. With a hiss, the tip of the sword extended and then retracted like a viper's tongue. Like lightning, it left his neck. The expert Xinqi and life force also left his body along with the sword that had left his neck. His eyes were wide open like a dead fish, and he tried to cover his neck with one hand, but he found that he could no longer control any of the muscles in his body. His legs began to soften, his eyes began to darken, and he began to lose control of his bowels. He fell down and rolled on the ground like a gourd. He rolled past Yan Bingyun's frozen body and touched the high threshold of the city gate office before stopping. He was full of vigor, and a foul stench emanated from his body. In a flash, a sword that seemed to have stretched out from hell used a terrifying method to finish off 2 Juanshan conference aces. No one could react to what had happened. Even Yan Bingyun, whose life had been saved, couldn't react. He stood in shock where he was. Then, he felt his entire body lighten. In the next moment, he had been lifted by the neck by a black shadow and flown to the top of the city gate office. Following the shadows of the tall city walls, it moved toward the darkness of Jingdo. The darkness before dawn grew thicker and thicker. On the other hand, in the eyes of those people that intended to besiege and kill Yan Bingyun, they instead saw an even more terrifying scene. A black shadow seemed to have silently appeared within the crowd, and it easily and extremely swiftly killed 2 experts. It carried Yan Bingyun as if it was carrying a tattered sack, and it easily escaped from the encirclement of so many people. Because it was easy, it was terrifying. With 3 bangs, Yan Bingyun had already been rescued by this person. The soldiers of the city gate office didn't even have time to raise the bows in their hands. Who was this black shadow to have such terrifying power? Protected by the aces and soldiers at the very back, the eldest princess's face was slightly pale. She waved her hand to disperse the subordinates in front of her and walked out of the crowd. Looking in the direction the black shadow had escaped, she didn't know how she felt. Only her eyes grew brighter and brighter. The Overwatch Council is indeed very terrifying, thought the mastermind of the Jingdo Rebellion. The mastermind of the Jingdo Rebellion thought to himself. However, he did not feel too defeated. Since the person who had come today was the best assassin in the world. Given his reputation for being the best at killing people, she had no way of stopping him from using this ability to save Yan Bingyun. However, it shouldn't affect anything. Li Yunrui thought of this as she narrowed her eyes and looked at the soldiers at the city gate. At this time, the sky was gradually brightening. The sun below the horizon began to release countless little silver fish, allowing their bulging bellies to reflect their own light. Gradually, they chased away the thick darkness of Jingdo. The torches were no longer as bright. The warm morning light fell on everyone's bodies and cast shadows on the ground. Of course, the Overwatch Council was terrifying. The 8 bureaus had hidden dragons and crouching tigers. Who knew how many heroes were willing to cover their faces, give up their former glory, and throw themselves into the great work of the Qin Kingdom's secret agents? When this power was twisted together, the power that could be unleashed was something that even the Qin Kingdom's most powerful emperor was secretly wary of. In name, the Overwatch Council was a secret agency directly managed by the Qin Emperor. However, everyone knew that the reason the Overwatch Council was able to attract the service of so many aces and survive so powerfully in the Qin Kingdom for over 30 years was all because of the old cripple in the wheelchair. Presently, there were only 1,000 Overwatch Council officials in Jingdo, yet they were already so terrifying. They had broken into the royal palace, suppressed the Ministry of Justice, forcefully opened the celestial prison, and subdued the Jingdo government. In one night, they had flipped the entire Jingdo upside down. Fan Xian's plan was good, and Yan Bingyun's execution was good. To be able to achieve such an effect, it still relied on the Overwatch Council officials' powerful organizational abilities and iron-blooded obedience. These unique qualities of the Overwatch Council were all forged, bit by bit, into the soul of the Overwatch Council by Chen Pingping, the old cripple, and the first generation of the heads of the 8 bureaus over decades. Thus, the most powerful person in the Overwatch Council was not the Black Knights, Fan Xian, or the best assassin in the world. Rather, it was Chen Pingping and what he represented. Strangely, the Crown Prince and eldest princess had planned the assassination of the Emperor at Dong Mountain. The eldest princess also knew the power of the Overwatch Council, but it seemed that she had put too little attention on the Overwatch Council. At least, in the eyes of the uneasy Crown Prince, if he was going to ascend to the throne, if he didn't first control Chen Pingping, who would sit on that throne. Fortunately, Chen Pingping had been poisoned and was isolated outside of Jingdo. The Crown Prince had thought that this was all his aunt's doing. No one knew that this matter had nothing to do with Li Yunrui. From the beginning, Li Yunrui had never thought about dealing with the Qin garden outside Jingdo and the old man in the wheelchair. It wasn't because she didn't value Qin Pingping or because she thought Qin Pingping was an old strange creature that could never be destroyed. It was because she had a secret. The secret was only one person's secret. The rest of the people in the clan did not know. After the news of Qin Pingping being poisoned by the Dongi master reached Jingdo, everyone's heart jumped. They thought the old cripple was pretending to be something. When the news of the assassination of the emperor at Dong Mountain came, the Empress Dowager ordered Qin Pingping to immediately enter the palace, but Qin Pingping remained in Qin Garden. Everyone began to guess something. Had Qin Pingping truly been poisoned? Therefore, there was an old man who had known Qin Pingping for decades, who was tempted and had a thought. This old man had always had a secret fear of Qin Pingping. If he didn't kill him, he would not feel at ease. Furthermore, the present situation was not good. As the saying goes, take his life when he is ill. If he didn't take advantage of this time to take Qin Pingping's life, the old man would feel sorry for himself. After the old Qin master, who grew cabbages, left Jingdo to take control of the army and his son took back the power of the Jingdo garrison, the first order he gave was to slaughter Qin Garden. Qin Garden had become a wasteland. In Fan Xian's eyes, Qin Garden, which was even more luxurious than the Jiangnan Ming family's garden, had become countless black and gray ruins. Those beautiful and elegant gardens had already been burnt to black soil. Those exquisite and grand houses had already been reduced to innumerable halves of stone walls. Green smoke was still rising from everywhere, but it no longer had that scorching heat, and looked abnormally desolate. If Fan Xian saw this scene, his heart would probably ache to death and he would loudly curse those people who didn't know how to treasure. From ancient times until now, the military had been an existence that had least need for artistic beauty. Thus, when a branch of the Qin family's army charged into Qin Garden with lightning speed, it was only natural that they set a fire. The reason for this fire was not similar to the fire of the Eight-Nation Coalition Army. The bandits of the Eight-Nation Coalition Army thought there were too many things and couldn't move them away, so they simply burned it and didn't leave it for the people. The reason the Qin family's army set a fire was because they hadn't stolen anything or captured anyone. The traps outside Qin Garden that had once terrified Fan Xian still existed. The Qin family's army had only broken into Qin Garden after over 300 people had died. However, they didn't find a single living person in Qin Garden. What welcomed them was an empty garden. Director Qin, who was rumored to be poisoned and bedridden, was not in the garden. His beautiful serving girls were also not in the garden. The servants and servants were not in the garden. Everyone seemed to have left a long time ago. They had left unusually cleanly. Even the paintings hanging on the walls of Qin Garden had been taken down. Qin Pingping liked those paintings. This army controlled by the Qin family was mainly made up of the Jingdo garrison. The leader was a general of the second generation of the Qin family. He was Qin Hang's cousin. He looked at the empty Qin Garden in exasperation. Thinking of how he had led the army to attack and had died so many people only to occupy an empty garden, he couldn't help but want to vomit blood. In his anger, this Qin general had set a fire. In the raging flames, he ordered a fast horse to report back to the Yuantai camp. He didn't dare lead the army back because the old Qin master had given a death order. Since he had moved against Qin Garden, he had to kill Qin Pingping before he could return to the army. Helpless, he could only wipe away his usual pride and respectfully ask the black-clothed man beside him for advice. This black-clothed man had been sent by the old man to help him. On the way the army had attacked, he had said that Qin Garden would be empty at this time. At the time, this Qin general still didn't believe it. Now, he had no choice but to believe it. He sighed in his heart. After all, he was an elder of the Overwatch Council. He knew Qin Pingping's power and calculations much better. The masked Yan Ruohai rode beside General Qin and said, "Since the director has left, then you should be mentally prepared. Don't think about catching him in a short amount of time." General Qin paused. Yan Ruohai glanced at him and mockingly said, "Don't forget, he is Chen Pingping." After saying this, he pulled the horse's head and rode out of Qin Garden. He could not bear to look at the raging fire in Qin Garden behind him. He thought to himself, "I wonder how this general who set fire to Qin Garden will be cut into pieces by the headmaster in the future." He was a member of the Qin family. This secret seemed to only be known by the Qin family. The crown prince and eldest princess did not know. However, he was a member of the Overwatch Council. This secret was truly only known by the Overwatch Council. Of course, the Qin family did not know. Jingdo gradually became a city of danger. Memorials from various roads and counties entered the capital, but no edict came out of Jingdo. Fortunately, in this day and age, the exchange of information was inconvenient. Everyone was used to a slow pace. Even if the provinces around Jingdo felt it was strange, they did not panic because of Jingdo's dangerous situation. At least, for the next few days, the entire Qin kingdom, other than Jingdo and Dongshan Road, was peaceful as usual. The morning in Weizhou was no different from the morning in Jingdo. The director of the Overwatch Council, Chen Pingping, who should have been in Jingdo dealing with the matter of the throne or treating poison in Qin Garden, raised his eyes to glance at the light in the sky above the courtyard. He furrowed his brows and began to raise his chopsticks to eat porridge and buns. Usually, in Qin Garden, the old man also liked to eat these two things. When the Empress Dowager's edict reached Qin Garden, this old ancestor of the Qing Secret Service immediately ordered his servants to prepare a carriage and pack his luggage. He did not return to the capital. Instead, he slipped away with unusual speed. Fan Xian and the Great Prince stood on the palace walls with worried faces, thinking about running away. Unexpectedly, the elder closest to them did this much more cleanly and efficiently than them. After a group of carriages left Qin Garden, they circled around the countryside to the south of Jingdo. The Qin family's army behind the carriages continued to persevere in searching for the whereabouts of the carriages, intending to kill them in one fell swoop. However, Chen Pingping was not in a hurry. The carriages did not increase their speed. They didn't even purposely hide their tracks. They only lured the army to circle behind them. The carriages circled 3 times to the south of Jingdo. The army also circled 3 times. The reason they never ran into them, other than the Overwatch Council's powerful intelligence network among the people outside the capital and their ability to hide their tracks, was because the army had an excellent guide. Yan Ruohai led the Qin family to chase after Chen Pingping. Even if one thought with their buttocks, one would know that as long as Chen Pingping was not willing, then they would never catch up. The fleeing carriages, which seemed to be on a tour, finally stopped in a manor outside Weizhou, the largest province to the south of Jingdo. Chen Pingping estimated that it was about time. Chen Pingping was eating porridge. His teeth were fine and he was not leaning against the wall. However, the Overwatch Council elders sitting beside him looked at the director's gaze and felt that he was somewhat shameless. Jingdo is in such a mess, and your 2 nephews are risking their lives. How could you have the heart to run away by yourself? There were 3 people sitting around Chen Pingping's breakfast table. One was an old servant who had served him for decades in Qin Garden. The other was the previous head of the 7th Bureau, the Baldy, whom Fan Xian had once seen in the Overwatch Council Celestial Prison. The other was one of the wings of the Overwatch Council, who was as famous as Wang Qinian, Zhong Jue. From the back of the manor came the faint sounds of young concubines washing up and joking after waking up. These women did not know that they were fleeing. The expressions of the 3 Overwatch Council elders were not very good. Zhong Jue pressed his lips together and moistened his nervous and parched lips. The pursuers are close. Director, we should make some plans. They are about to move their troops back. This matter is not urgent. Chen Pingping put down his chopsticks and wiped his mouth neatly. Go out and make arrangements. Yes. Zhong Zhui and the bald head of the 7th Bureau accepted their orders and left. Only Chen Pingping and the old servant were left in the courtyard. Suddenly, Chen Pingping began to cough uncomfortably. The old man's face became blood red and then quickly became a deathly white. A trickle of blood seeped from the corner of his lips. The old servant cried and said, Master, we have to call Sir Fei back. Otherwise, what will we do with the poison? Chen Pingping had actually been poisoned. He sat in the wheelchair and smiled self-mockingly. The poison won't kill him. It's just a bit uncomfortable. Master, the capital is dangerous. Are you really not worried about Sir Fan Jr.? The old servant glanced at Chen Pingping and asked carefully. The wrinkles on Chen Pingping's old face suddenly increased. A moment later, he sighed and said, How can I not be worried? However, even if the matter fails, presumably he will still be alive. As long as he is alive, everything is fine. The old servant thought to himself that this matter involved the fight for the throne. If Sir Fan Jr. was truly defeated, how could he survive? Furthermore, if the crown prince truly inherited the throne, his group of carriages would probably not be able to find a place to stay in this vast Qin kingdom. The old servant suddenly thought of something and was overjoyed. Yes, there is still Minister Fan and King Jing who have not acted. These days, Chen Pingping had often discussed the situation in Jingdo with his old subordinates. The old servant had been listening to them from the side. He had a very clear understanding of the comparison of power in Jingdo. If the 13 city gate guards truly failed and the Yi and Qin families' armies entered the capital, how could the Overwatch Council stop them? Unless Fan Jian and King Jing had the power to flip the heavens in their hands, Director Qin would not be able to sit peacefully in his wheelchair and not worry for Fan Xian. King Jing and Old Qin are the same. They only vent their anger at the ground, Chen Pingping said with slight mockery. In Fan Jian's life, he wins by enduring silently, but he also loses by enduring silently. Where does he have enough power to change the situation? He is afraid that the palace will suspect him. All these years, Minister Fan has endured silently. Now, he has also endured silently. After saying this, Chen Pingping fell silent. He knew where Fan Jian's greatest strength was, but the problem was that His Majesty had taken all those people with him when he went to worship the heavens. He still didn't know if any of them would survive. A few white pigeons flew into the courtyard following the direction of the morning light. The old servant went forward to catch one and brought it in front of Chen Pingping. Chen Pingping untied the thin tube on the pigeon's leg and looked at the words on it. His brows gradually furrowed. A moment later, he summoned an Overwatch Council subordinate and ordered in a heavy voice, "Follow the order from a few days ago. Everyone move. Continue to seal off any news from Dongshan Road. The court's group heading to receive the spirit is almost here." Yes. After a long time, Chen Pingping finally woke up from his dazed state. It was not until now that this most powerful schemer in the Qin kingdom finally felt a glimmer of powerlessness. Perhaps it was the power of the poison or perhaps it was the power of old age, but it made him feel a glimmer of fatigue and faint disappointment. Fan Xian won't die so easily. Chen Pingping didn't know if he was comforting the old servant or himself. Calmly, he said, "At least I've helped this kid attract 6,000 soldiers. The pressure on him will lessen a great deal. You have to know that it is not an easy matter to make someone die." Chen Pingping pushed the wheelchair toward the back of the courtyard. The old servant quickly pushed it. As they passed by a flower bed, Chen Pingping's expression did not change as he looked at a small white flower shivering in the early autumn. He stopped and looked at it for a long time. Then, he slowly bent down and plucked a flower. Carefully, he placed it on his ear. The old servant smiled and pushed him into a side room in the back of the courtyard. When he entered the side room, Chen Pingping suddenly said to him, if Fan Xian knew he was a father, he would certainly learn to value his life even more. The light in the side room was not very bright, but he could clearly see a woman around 20 years old looking at the baby in her arms with a face full of tenderness. This woman, whose face glowed with motherly love, was Cici, who had disappeared in the Fan Manor on the outskirts of Jingdou. The baby in her arms. Chen Pingping pushed the wheelchair forward and took the newborn baby from her hands with a face full of tenderness. Looking at the blush on the baby's face and tightly closed eyes, he flicked his tongue and cooed a few times. Teasingly, he said, little girl is very good. When your father sees you, he will definitely like you very much. Cici smiled sweetly as she watched this scene. Suddenly, she saw the little white flower on the corner of Chen Pingping's forehead and asked curiously, Director, why is there a flower? Last time, when I held this child, she cried. It looks like I'm too ugly. Today, there's another flower, look, she's indeed not crying. The wrinkles on Chen Pingping's face turned into a chrysanthemum. That kind of tenderness could not be faked. He probably really liked the little girl in his arms as if she was his own granddaughter. Having just given birth, Cici's strength was not very good. Gazing at Chen Pingping, she suddenly said with sadness, however, I don't know when the young master will come back. When Chen Pingping took her away, Cici was also shocked. When she gave birth, Wan and the people she was familiar with in the Fan Manor were not by her side. There was only the midwife that Chen Pingping had arranged. This girl's state of mind had been greatly tormented. However, she knew Director Qin did not have any ill intentions. She just didn't understand why she had to give birth outside the manor. She couldn't help but think of the secrets of some large family. Her mood had always been low. In a few days, Fan Xian will be back. Chen Pingping smiled and comforted her. The most important thing for a pregnant woman is to be happy. That's why he asked me to take you out for a walk. This reason was clearly a bit far-fetched, but Cici's mind was clearly not very good after giving birth. She actually believed it. You rest first. Chen Pingping was so happy that he refused to let go of the little baby girl for a moment. He said to Cici, I'm going to take the child out for a walk. Cici said, you can't let the wind blow. Chen Pingping nodded obediently. In front of a mother, he had to be more obedient to steal her child to play with. Chen Pingping played with the baby girl all the way to another room. He said to the person in the room, let me show you, Fan Xian's daughter. The person was tied up tightly. His expression was uneasy and sad. Hearing these words, he suddenly became happy and said, Director, has the young mistress given her a name? He suddenly saw the little white flower by Chen Pingping's hair and said with a thought, let's call her Fan Xiaohua. Sir will definitely like it. The person who gave the name was Fan Xian's trusted aide, Wang Qinian. No one knew how this person had escaped from Dong Mountain or why he had been tied up in Chen Pingping's room. Chen Pingping glared at him and said, what dog sh*t? Wang Qinian had clearly lost a lot of weight. It looked like after escaping from Dong Mountain, he had suffered a lot on the way. He looked at the little baby girl in the director's arms. Amidst his joy, he suddenly thought of his family's daughter in the capital and Fan Xian, who was in the eye of the storm. For some reason, his nose became sore. I wonder if Sir will be able to see his own daughter. With a mournful expression, he said, what exactly is going on? I don't understand. Chen Pingping's expression was calm. I also don't understand what will happen in Jingdou, but I know something will certainly happen in Jingdou. Fan Xian stood on the walls of the royal palace and looked at the rising sun in the east. His brows gradually furrowed together and he sighed. Up until now, he still had not found Wan and Dabao's whereabouts. Fortunately, King Jing's manor had sent word that his father and Lady Lu were both safe and well. They were heading in the direction of the royal palace. Counting on his fingers, Cece's due date had also arrived. He didn't know if the girl who had mysteriously disappeared was well or if the child was a boy or a girl. Of all his family, the one he was least worried about was Cece, who was about to give birth. Since the manor had tacitly approved of this matter, the person who had taken Cece could not be anyone else. It had to be the lonely old cripple in Chen Garden. What he was worried about was Yan Bingyun. After Yan Bingyun entered the city gate department, there had been no news. There was also no sign of the Overwatch Council person responsible for reporting information. All of this indicated that something had gone wrong. Fan Xian notified the Great Prince to begin making arrangements. He was only confused as to why Yan Bingyun had not sent out a signal. The morning sun leaped over the horizon. Fan Xian's heart suddenly jumped. It was as if he felt that something beautiful was happening in the world. Chapter 560. Yuan Hongdao struggled to wake up. There was a sharp pain at the back of his head. He didn't know what environment he was in. His long life of hiding among enemy factions had made him used to constant silence. Like Wang Qinian, this Overwatch Council official actually had countless questions in his heart. Half a year ago, when the Emperor first took action against the eldest princess, although Yuan Hongdao didn't know the reason the Overwatch Council was able to sweep clean the eldest princess' apparent power within an hour was because they relied on this so-called top strategist in Xinyang. What had puzzled Yuan Hongdao for the past half year was that, after that operation, he should have left his life as a spy. According to the rules of the council, he should have chosen a place with beautiful mountains and clear waters to retire with honor. However, after escaping from the courtyard, Yan Ruohai had told him to return to Xinyang. Return to Xinyang. The eldest Princess Xinyang strategist had luckily escaped the Overwatch Council's pursuit. Logically speaking, he should be returning to Xinyang. However, Yuan Hongdao sensed something else from the Overwatch Council's order. If after that night of thunder and rain, the eldest princess was destined to fall and be forever imprisoned, then why would Director Chen call him back to Xinyang? What exactly was the court thinking? What was he going to do in Xinyang? Yuan Hongdao had been thinking about this question for a few months. When the eldest princess easily passed on her plan to Xinyang through the guards of the courtyard and gradually moved the people in Xinyang to Jingdou, he finally understood some things. From the beginning of the Overwatch Council's operation, they knew that it was impossible for the eldest princess to be completely defeated. Perhaps the emperor had never planned for the eldest princess to never have the power to rise again. That was why he had him, a nail, return to Xinyang to wait for the eldest princess's summons and for that moment to come. The emperor had gone to Dong Mountain and been assassinated. Jingdou was in chaos. The crown prince was about to ascend to the throne. The eldest princess had contacted the military to prepare for rebellion. Even if the eldest princess did not let Yuan Hongdao know when she planned the Dong Mountain situation, Yuan Hongdao had personally participated in all of the subsequent events. He had already learned of the news at the beginning of the eldest princess's plan. It seemed that it was time for him to display his abilities as the top spy in the Qin kingdom. However, Yuan Hongdao was shocked to find that he was unable to pass on the information. He was unable to notify the Overwatch Council. All the channels were instantly disabled, and the bridge of one-way communication was mysteriously cut off. Yuan Hongdao was unable to contact Yan Ruohai, much less Chen Pingping. For a spy of his level, it was even more impossible for him to directly rush into the Overwatch Council and yell. His expression was calm, but his heart was terrified and uneasy. He didn't know exactly what had happened in the Overwatch Council. This kind of uneasy state continued until Fan Xian finally broke into the palace and began to use the martial power of his subordinates to sweep away the opposition in Jingdo. Yuan Hongdao had secretly cooperated with the Overwatch Council's actions and allowed the eldest princess' temporary royal courtyard to be taken. However, he knew that Fan Xian had already made a fatal mistake. Thus, in the last moment, he took the risk of calling out to the Overwatch Council official. He didn't trust anyone. In comparison, since he couldn't contact Chen Pingping and Yan Ruohai, in the entire court, the only person he trusted the most was Chen Pingping's successor, Sir Fan Jr. Unfortunately, he didn't know what kind of a hothead Mu Feng was, so he was miserably knocked down with one punch. Yuan Hongdao calmed his breathing and opened his eyes. He discovered that he was in a corner tower above the imperial city, and in front of him was a handsome young man who was looking at him with a worried expression. Yuan Hongdao knew this person's identity. Although he didn't know why this person would personally interrogate him at such a tense moment, Yuan Hongdao directly said, "Zhang Fang belongs to the eldest princess." Fan Xian nodded and didn't say anything. The commander of the 13 city gate guards, Zhang Fang, had the courtesy named Iching. Everyone thought he was a righteous and loyal figure. Yet, he belonged to the eldest princess. This reality was enough to shock everyone. However, it was no longer able to add too much worry to his already helpless emotions. Yan Bingyun had not returned. The official responsible for keeping watch in the council had also not returned. There had to be something wrong with the city gate guards. Unfortunately, Yuan Hongdao had woken up too late. Fan Xian sighed in his heart. It was almost dawn. The Jingdo city gate guards had fallen. The Yi and Qin family's armies had entered the city at some point. At such a critical moment, he shouldn't have thought of Yuan Hongdao. However, looking at the officials resting in Taiji Palace, he, filled with helplessness, suddenly remembered the words his father-in-law had once said to him in Wuzhou. Other than Chen Pingping and Fan Jian, there were 3 people Lin Ruofu feared in court. Other than Chen Pingping and Fan Jian, it was the old Qin master, who led the army. This powerful figure had told Fan Xian seriously that he would not give his trump card in court to Fan Xian in case the tree stood out in the forest and was blown down by the wild winds. Unless, when the new emperor ascended the throne. Presently, the Qing emperor had already died. Fan Xian was in Jingdo helping the 3rd prince steal the throne. Thus, the Lin civil officials in Jingdo tore off their disguises and stood behind Fan Xian, following the scholars Hu and Shu to stop the crown prince from ascending the throne. Fan Xian thought to himself that his father-in-law had been clever his whole life. His timing was very accurate. However, he didn't know if he would succeed this time. However, Prime Minister Lin's last words were remembered clearly by Fan Xian. If the capital truly becomes chaotic in the future, perhaps Yuan Hongdao can help you. A year ago, Lin Ruofu had calculated the Dong Mountain incident. Fan Xian admired his father-in-law's foresight to the point of prostrating himself on the ground, so he did not forget this move he had given him. When he sank into a dangerous situation he could not extricate himself from, he immediately thought of the top strategist in Xinyang under the eldest princess' command. Indeed, Sir Yuan was a spy the Overwatch Council had planted in Xinyang. This reality shocked Fan Xian and immediately made him vexed. If he had known of the problem with the city gate guards earlier, he and the great prince would not have been so passive. In the end, it was still too late. In the end, this was still a matter of fate. He didn't know how much longer his good luck could last. Yuan Hongdao stared into Fan Xian's eyes and said, "Why have I been unable to contact the council?" Although these words were calm, there was no lack of anger in them. There was none of Sir Yuan's usual ease. He had precious intelligence on the eldest princess' side in his hands, but he was unable to provide it to the Overwatch Council and court. His loyalty to the Qin kingdom and the emperor made Sir Yuan feel that something was very strange. Thus, he became angry. Fan Xian was silent and didn't know what to say. If possible, he wanted to personally ask Chen Pingping. The morning wind blew into the tall corner tower of the royal palace, causing the smell of blood from last night to gradually fade. The smell of burning in the private residences in Jingdo also disappeared. However, the pitiful commoners still did not dare to leave their homes. With great fear, they closed their doors and hid in their beds, praying that the killing game of these major figures would quickly end. Above the royal palace, the bugle horns rang out repeatedly. The sound was powerful and powerful. No one knew how far it could travel. Fan Xian stood by Yuan Hongdao's side. With a calm expression, he said, "The Jingdo garrison won't be able to enter the capital until noon. The Qin and Yi families still need another 3 days. If we move quickly, we can still take back the 9 city gates." A glimmer of shock flashed through Yuan Hongdao's eyes. Immediately after, a flame of anger burned in them. In a great rage, he said, "Is there no one in the garrison in the council?" Fan Xian's heart jumped and he abruptly turned to look at him. Yuan Hongdao gazed at him and said each word clearly, "The Qin family's army has advanced through the night. I'm afraid they are not far from Jingdo." Fan Xian pressed his lips tightly together. His face became pale. He had not panicked even after learning of the news of the city gate department's betrayal because he believed he had a clear grasp of the old Qin family's movements. As long as the army had not arrived, he still had time to retake control of the 9 city gates with the more powerful Imperial Army and Overwatch Council's destructive power. The Qin family's army was about to arrive. Yan Bingyun's father was in the Qin family. How could he not have sent back news of the army's departure? Fan Xian walked to the great prince's side and said, "Withdraw the soldiers and return to the palace. The Qin family's army is about to arrive." The great prince's brows were furrowed tightly. The imperial army had just left the royal palace. Now, they had to withdraw because of a piece of news that he could not believe. He knew that what he cared about the most right now was the speed of his reaction. He didn't have time to discuss anything with Fan Xian. Taking a deep breath, he had the soldier at his side wave the little yellow flag in his hand. The yellow flag flipped, and the horn sounded again from above the royal palace. The rhythm gradually picked up and tightened. The imperial army, which was charging out of the royal palace like a few dragons, suddenly heard the sound of the horn returning to camp. Without prior agreement, they all pulled back and began to head back in the direction of the royal palace. In the distance, the group that had already entered deep into the residential streets and alleys also began to move. Fan Xian made a hand gesture to the subordinate beside him. The subordinate nodded and took out an arrow of command from his sleeve. Sending it out, it drew out a wretched cry in the air in front of the royal palace. Immediately after, the sound of an arrow of command rang out from the Bureau of Military Affairs, the headquarters of the Overwatch Council, the offices of the various departments, and the important streets as a response. When the signal arrow fell, the nearly 2,000 secret agents of the Overwatch Council in Jingdo heard the order and moved, disappearing into the streets and alleys. In a moment, not a single person could be seen on the streets of Jingdo, particularly on Tianhe Avenue, which passed through the Overwatch Council and Bureau of Military Affairs and led directly to the royal palace. It was so deserted that it made one's heart palpitate. There were only a few green leaves that had been blown down by the autumn wind and rolled on the empty street. It doesn't matter how the crown prince found out about the raid and escaped. Fan Xian stood beside the great prince and said, "It is clear that the eldest princess left the palace prepared. She had long guessed what we would do. The great prince's brows were furrowed tightly as he looked down at all the activity in Jingdo. He analyzed in his heart which direction the army would enter the capital from and what he should do next. In order to break into the palace, all of our forces killed their way in, but she commanded the armies of the Yi and Qin families, and slowly came in through the city gate guards that we couldn't control. Fan Xian calmly said, "She gave the royal palace to us and then surrounded it to play. Does this count as inviting the enemy into a trap?" I had wanted to have a flower in my stomach and fire on all sides. Unexpectedly, this fire did not burn her. On the contrary, she used a layer of gauze to bind this flower of mine. Fan Xian's palm gently patted the sturdy bricks of the royal palace. Faintly, he said, "In the end, we still underestimated this ant." The eldest princess knew where Fan Xian and the Overwatch Council's advantage was. Thus, she was willing to retreat and let Fan Xian break into the palace and appear to control everything. Presently, the palace had the Empress Dowager, the third prince, Yi Guipin, Ning the Talented, countless nobles, the scholars Hu and Shu, and countless civil officials and subordinates loyal to Fan Xian. These people were power, but they were also a burden. If Fan Xian had a pair of wings, then the people the eldest princess had purposely left in the palace would be like hammers on Fan Xian's wings, preventing him from flying as he pleased. Even if the army surrounded the city, they probably wouldn't be able to surround a terrifying nocturnal ace like Fan Xian. However, he carried the legacy of the Qin kingdom and the lives of countless people in the palace on his shoulders. How could Fan Xian escape? Could he bear to escape? The great prince had been silent the entire time. Occasionally, he would give orders and begin to prepare to defend the royal palace and prepare all the equipment. He did not have the leisure to chat with Fan Xian at such a time. He knew what kind of terrifying danger he was about to face. Fan Xian looked woodenly at everything in Jingdo. It was as if he could see Li Yunrui's extremely beautiful face looking at him with a delicate and timid gaze. Quietly, she said, "My good son-in-law, I have prepared many things for you." He spat toward the palace and the royal palace as if he wanted to spit on her face. However, he had to admit that his mother-in-law was indeed much stronger than him in these areas. Fan Xian thought to himself that if it weren't for those strange reasons, he would not be trapped in the royal palace right now. "How long can we defend?" he asked the great prince. The great prince's expression was solemn. In a low voice, he said, "The royal palace's walls are high. If the Yi and Qin families attack in the middle of the night and don't bring large siege weapons, I can defend until the last moment." As the commander of the Western Expedition Army, the great prince had experienced countless bloody battles in his life. Thus, when faced with the army approaching the capital, he did not panic at all. However, the last moment in this sentence had already explained everything. Since Li Yunrui already had a plan, the Yi and Qin families should have made preparations, Fan Xian said with his head lowered. "I only hope that you can hold out for a few more days. Leading the army into battle can only depend on you. Hold out until the messengers notify the various garrisons and the governors of the 6 roads to send reinforcements." The great prince swept a glance at him and said rudely, "Give up on that thought. It is impossible for those messengers to still be alive." Fan Xian sighed in his heart and thought, "I am not waiting for those people. Last night, I had a stomachache and tossed and turned in bed. When I woke up today, my mind was completely muddled." Chapter 561. A wave of hurried footsteps rang out on the palace walls. A few armored imperial soldiers rushed in front of the two of them, knelt down on one knee, and said a few words. Fan Xian stood behind the great prince and listened calmly. He did not feel any shock in his heart. After a night of searching, They had captured the empress but not the crown prince. The soldiers sent to the Yi and Qin families had also come up empty. Just like how the eldest princess had sent people to surround the Fan Manor, they had also come up empty. Even though these older figures no longer had the ruthlessness of the past, they could still see the direction of the storm clearly. Since the Yi and Qin families had hardened their hearts to lead the eldest princess in rebellion, how could they let Fan Xian and the others capture any useful hostages? As for the other personal officials, they split up to report to the Great Prince on the current defensive situation in Jingdo. The Great Prince furrowed his brows slightly as he listened. He waved his hand for them to leave. Turning to Fan Xian, he said, "The situation at hand is that if we retreat into the palace according to the plan, it is the same as giving them all the territory outside the royal palace. If the rebel army sets up their formation and surrounds the palace, we will no longer have the power to overturn the situation." Fan Xian looked at him. "The problem is, if we begin to harass the moment the rebel army enters the city, we will only be able to harass them. It won't be of much use at all," the Great Prince said. "I have too few soldiers in my hands." At this time, the sun had already risen. The red rays of light shone on the vermilion red walls of the palace and then reflected out, causing the entire palace and the large square in front of it to be enveloped in a warm color. Even the clear and quiet moat at the back of the palace was soaked in a heart-palpitating red, like fresh blood. "If we want to delay, we must attack the moment they enter Jingdo." The Great Prince looked at the morning sun and narrowed his eyes. The Great Prince looked at the rising sun and narrowed his eyes. "The problem at hand is that the Overwatch Council's secret agents are blocked off by the four walls and have no way of sending in intelligence reports. We must guess which city gate the army will enter the capital from. There is some distance from the city gate to the royal palace. It is enough for us to kill some of their spirit," Fan Xian said with his head lowered. "If I really have to guess which city gate the army will enter the capital from, I bet Jingyang Gate." "I have the same thoughts." The Great Prince nodded. The rebel army was heading straight for Jingdo from Yuantai camp. The closest city gate was Xingyang Gate. Furthermore, the offices of the 13 city gate guards were also located there. Although Zhang Deqing had rebelled, only that city gate was personally controlled by him. It was the safest and smoothest route for the eldest princess army to enter the capital through that gate. The first prince frowned and said, "I left a group of cavalry there." Fan Xian glanced at him. A strange light flashed through his eyes. The difference in strength between them and the enemy was too great. It was impossible to defend against the enemy outside the city gates. However, he and the Great Prince had to give the rebel army a deep, memorable blow the moment they entered the city. Only then could they reduce the rebel army's spirit. However, this group of soldiers would definitely be swallowed up by the surging power of the army, and not a single one of them would survive. Seeming to sense what Fan Xian was thinking, the Great Prince furrowed his brows slightly and said in a low voice, "As a soldier of the Qin Kingdom, it is only right that we risk our lives." Fan Xian thought bitterly. It was only a struggle for power among the emperor's family, yet they wanted these common soldiers to shed their blood. At this moment, a gust of morning wind swept past. Along with the wind were some voices filled with hot-bloodedness and murderous intent. It was the colonels of the imperial army who had begun to mobilize their subordinates for the final battle. For a time, the atmosphere inside and outside the imperial city was somber and the air seemed to be filled with tension. "I ask you one last time. Do you want to leave?" The Great Prince narrowed his eyes and looked at the city gate in the east. He didn't even glance at Fan Xian. Once the army has surrounded the palace, it will be impossible to break through. He and Fan Xian had discussed this a number of times. The Great Prince was willing to lead the imperial army to lure the rebel army into Jingdo to carry out a bloody slaughter. Fan Xian, with the help of 1,000 Overwatch Council secret agents, would lead the people in the palace to find a way out, kill their way out of the city gates, and quickly head south to Weizhou. Fan Xian gently shook his head, just like he had the last few times they had discussed it. Putting aside the possibility of success in breaking through, even if they could, he would not let the great prince be torn to pieces by the eldest princess's army alone. Furthermore, he still had a great hope in his heart that kept his feet firmly on the palace walls. He followed the direction of the great prince's gaze and stared at the increasingly solemn Xingyang Gate under the rising sun. He didn't say a word. Jingdou did not wake up with the rise of the sun. Hundreds of thousands of commoners stayed in their homes in fear, straining their ears to listen to the movements outside. The streets between the private residences, Tianhe Avenue, and various yamens were all empty and silent. It was so quiet and cold that it made one feel that the early day was still an endless night. Jingdou had become an isolated city, a dead city. An ominous sound suddenly came through the morning wind. It seemed that the heavy Jingdou city gates had been opened by someone. There was no sound of horse hooves or horse neighing. There was no sound of armor and long swords clashing against each other. There was no military banner fluttering. At such a distance, one shouldn't be able to hear the sound of the city gates opening and closing. In such a deathly silent Jingdou, any strange movement from the city gates would touch on the sensitive thoughts of the people in the royal palace. Fan Xian abruptly turned his head and looked in a few directions to the west and south. He focused on the green smoke that the Overwatch Council secret agents had risked their lives to send out. His pupils constricted slightly. A moment later, he and the great prince met each other's eyes and said, "We all guessed wrong." The expression on the great prince's face was extremely serious as he nodded his head. Green smoke rose in all directions as the horn gradually sounded. Looking down from the royal palace, one could see that dozens of clumps of dust had appeared on the outer walls of Jingdou in different directions. The sound of hooves was like thunder. It was rumbling from the city gates, following the roads in all directions in Jingdou, toward the royal palace. Fan Xian and the great prince had guessed that the rebel army would enter the capital through Xingyang Gate. They had not expected that the rebel army would enter the capital so openly and forcefully from all 9 city gates at the same time. The two princes on the palace walls sucked in a breath of cold air and wondered just how many people the eldest princess had in the rebel army. They dared to divide their forces to enter the capital through the 9 city gates and openly suppress the city, creating such a terrifying scene. In an instant, Jingdou was surrounded by smoke. Outside Jingdou's Xingyang Gate, the yellow earth was crushed by the galloping hooves of horses. It was then kicked up and turned into a cloud of dust and smoke. It gradually rose and became a cloud of yellow smoke, blocking out the light from the rising sun above the horizon. It made both inside and outside the city gates somewhat dark. The 5,000-man cavalry army rode in a row of 5 at a steady speed toward the wide-open Xingyang Gate. Everything appeared silent and fast. The dust kicked up by the horses' hooves was swept into the city gates by the charge of these fine horses. It looked like a headless and tailless yellow dragon struggling endlessly into Jingdou with the intention of swallowing those pitiful commoners. In the yellow soil that filled the sky, a large military flag was fluttering in the wind. A large Qin character was painted on the black flag. The last stroke of the Qin character was forcefully thrust out. It looked like an indestructible power. Even in the sky full of dust, it was still full of murderous intent. The former deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs, the present commander of the Jingdou garrison, and the leading figure of the second generation of the Qin family, Qin Heng, was under this flag. He calmly watched his army enter Jingdou with an unstoppable aura. He narrowed his eyes but did not cover his mouth and nose to avoid breathing in the yellow soil. He only calmly watched all of this. An unusually complicated emotion rose in his chest. As the commander of the Jingdo garrison, he was very familiar with Xingyang Gate. He knew that if the city gates were tightly shut and they only relied on these 3,000 riders, they would probably not be able to charge into Jingdo even after 3 years. The Qin kingdom's capital had been surrounded by foreign enemies before, but it had never been broken into the city. This Jingdo, which did not have a long history, fully demonstrated its powerful defensive power. Now, this Jingdo city gate had finally fallen. Just as Zhuang Mohan had once said in his book, the most powerful capitals in history were often taken from the inside. The Qin kingdom's rebellion this time was no exception. Qin Heng watched all of this. As a soldier of the Qin kingdom, his emotions were complicated. He felt great admiration and fear for the eldest princess, who had easily taken control of the 13 city gate guards. However, the present situation did not allow him to think too much. The army had entered the capital through 9 city gates. The group of riders he led went through Xingyang Gate. He had to reach the royal palace before everyone else. This time, the army had gathered the armies of the Qin and Yi families, as well as the Jingdo garrison. There were 30,000 people in total, while the royal palace's defensive power added up to less than 6,000 people. The army entering the capital had to be open and above board. They had to suppress the people in the royal palace until their hearts trembled and they surrendered. For Qin Heng, fighting this battle with 6 against 1 was not a difficult matter. He had never thought that the people he was familiar with in the royal palace would be able to oppose such a powerful army. The horses and soldiers rushing past in front of him flashed through his eyes. Then, a person's name flashed through his mind. For Qin Heng, he was not worried about the royal palace. He was worried that Yi Zhong would reach the royal palace before him. Thinking of Yi Zhong's name, Qin Heng let out a murky breath. This permanent member of the Jingdo garrison had received the Empress Dowager's edict but had not returned to Dingzhou. Although it seemed that the Yi family's refusal to retreat was secretly arranged by the eldest princess and had great significance for the Jingdo battle, for the Qin family, the existence of the Yi family's military power had a different meaning. Yi Zhong was the second prince's father-in-law, and the Qin family naturally supported the crown prince. Thus, the old Qin master had given a death order. In order to stabilize the crown prince's throne, the Qin family's army had to perform valiantly in this battle and arrive before the Yi family. Qin Heng squeezed his horse's abdomen and led his personal camp to join the troops entering the city. He became the brightest scale on the yellow dragon. The rebel army entered Jingdo from 9 directions. The Qin family took 6, and the Yi family took 3. Because the rebel army was powerful and knew that Jingdo's defenses were weak, they didn't care about the problem of splitting up. On the contrary, entering with such a large force could make the royal palace lose the courage to break out again. The thousands of soldiers of the 13 city gate guards did not join the rebel army. The common soldiers watched this scene dumbfounded. They didn't know what had happened. Some clever officers had already guessed that one of the princes had rebelled, but they didn't dare move under the suppression of their officers. Commander Zhang Deqing was a clever man. He knew that in this kind of rebellion, even if he added a hand, he wouldn't be able to do much. Holding tightly to his own city gate guards was the truly clever choice. The sound of horse hooves rang out like thunder on the road from Xingyang Gate to the royal palace. The riders of the Qin army took out their weapons and became cautious. However, their speed did not decrease at all. They galloped past like a gust of wind. The color of the Qin family's light armor was also very dark. It was very similar to the Overwatch Council's Black Knights. However, it was missing a smear of the thickest black. There were a few patches of bright color on the chest of the armor. A dozen running riders suddenly broke away from the group and sped forward. Like lightning, they pierced into the quiet street. Brushing against the low eaves of private residences, they began to scout and report on the army's advance. Everything went as usual. These riders galloped into the streets, turned, and spread out like an arrowhead. They began to advance deep into the city. All of this happened quickly and naturally. It fully demonstrated the Qing army's level of training and the power of the Qin army. The main group of riders did not slow down. They continued forward in the direction the riders had stepped in. Qin Heng rode on his horse and led his personal camp. He stared coldly at the area in front of him. He knew that Fan Xian and the great prince would not sit and wait for death. On this quiet street there would certainly be ambushes and difficult killing. He didn't care how many people Fan Xian and the great prince had in their hands. He knew that what he wanted was the speed of the army and a powerful aura. No matter what kind of obstruction they faced, they had to use the army to ruthlessly crush through. The speed of the rebel army's advance was too fast. The riders at the front were unable to serve as scouts. They were just bravely bait. They were a bit like the martyrs in Fan Xian's world who bravely rolled through minefields. They used their lives to touch the deathly silent Jingdo and see just what kind of danger existed. However, the rebel army had already advanced 5,000 zhang from Jingyang Gate. The dozen or so brave riders still did not encounter any snipers. Even when they could faintly see the eaves of the imperial palace illuminated by the rising sun, the streets were still quiet. Hiss! About 300 feet away from the riders, the warhorses at the very front of the rebel army were breathing in Jingdo's air forcefully and maintaining a steady speed. At the same time, they began to whinny in pain. The whinny stopped. A number of warhorses fell to the ground at the same time. The warhorses' heavy bodies crashed ruthlessly into the green stone floor of the street, sending up a few strands of dust. It seemed to shake the entire street. The horse's head crashed heavily into the ground. Fresh blood spurted out. No matter how skilled the riders on the warhorses were, they were caught unprepared by this sudden change and fell to the ground. Before they could recover from the pain of their broken legs, a few black poison crossbow bolts shot out from the private residences on the side of the street and pierced ruthlessly into their bodies. Just as the first few warhorses fell to the ground and the riders were killed by the crossbow bolts, countless hissing sounds suddenly came from the quiet street. These sounds did not come from the mouths and noses of the galloping warhorses. Instead, they came from the ground. The streets of Jingdo were paved with square stones. The gaps between the stones were filled with yellow soil. The hissing sounds came from the fine yellow soil between the stones. At the same time, the yellow soil between the stones on the long street suddenly split open. There seemed to be some mysterious power on the two sides of the street. From the cracked yellow soil, thin black leather ropes shot up. The leather ropes were too thin and could not be tied to hooks. However, a faint light could be faintly seen. They should be thin needles dipped in poison. Dozens of specially made black horse tripping ropes suddenly and magically appeared on the street that had been flat just a moment ago. Countless muffled sounds rang out at the same time. The Qin army's main cavalry unit suffered a merciless attack. About 100 riders in total fell from the clouds in front of these dozens of horse-tripping ropes and smashed into the deep ground. For a moment, people and horses were thrown off their feet on the street. Wretched cries rang out. Countless people or horses had their tendons snapped or their bones broken. They crashed heavily into one another, rolling and bleeding. Immediately after, the whooshing sound of something breaking through the air rang out. These sounds were like whistles from the netherworld coming to collect lives. It made people's hearts tremble. Countless black crossbow bolts shot out from the private residences on the side of the street and landed on the bodies of the rebel soldiers on the ground. In an instant, their wretched cries stopped. In just a moment, there were more than 100 dead people on this half of the street. These dead people all had crossbow bolts stuck in their bodies. The ambushers did not shoot the horses. The poisoned warhorses lay powerlessly on the ground beside the bodies of their owners. As they whinnied in pain, they kicked their legs. The scene was incomparably wretched. Chapter 562. Actually, I had been sick for a few days. After the stomach pain, I caught a cold, and then I had a rhinitis. Today, it had finally reached its peak. I had been sitting in front of the computer for a few hours, and I had also gone to the toilet a few times. In total, I had only written a few hundred words. It was not a problem with my body, but with my mind. I had really been in so much pain that I could not write anymore. I did not write much in July, and the quality would definitely drop. This was something that I had helplessly predicted at the beginning of the month. People always had more important things to do in their lives. I felt apologetic, so I did not ask for votes this month. I asked everyone to vote for other colleagues who were more hardworking. But I did not expect that on the last day of the month, Qingyu's monthly votes would actually squeeze into the top 6. Thinking of this, I could not help but feel endless gratitude towards everyone. Everyone is a kind person, even more kind than me. After returning home for the past 10 days, I have been working hard to write, wanting to make up for it. But I did not expect that I would not be able to persist on the last day of the month. It is really a pity, and I am also a little disappointed you're tuning into the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.